The moment Charlotte Ashford realized her engagement was over, the orchestra was still playing. No announcement had been made. No scandal had yet rippled through the ballroom. No one was staring at her. Yet somehow, standing beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers of Lady Haverford's spring assembly in Mayfair, she knew. Across the crowded room, Ethan Fairmorn was smiling at another woman. Not politely. Not casually. Not as a gentleman smiled during a pleasant conversation. There was triumph in his expression. Possession. Relief. Charlotte felt something cold settle into her chest. Around her, London society continued its elegant performance. Ladies in silk gowns drifted across the polished floor like colourful clouds. Gentlemen discussed parliament, investments, and horse breeding near the refreshment tables. Servants moved quietly through the crowd carrying silver trays laden with tea and delicate pastries. The scent of beeswax candles and fresh flowers lingered in the air. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Yet Charlotte could not stop looking at Ethan. For 3 years she had known him. For 18 months she had been engaged to him. For nearly half a year she had noticed a growing distance she could never quite explain. Letters arrived less frequently. Visits became shorter. Excuses multiplied. Every instinct she possessed had whispered that something was wrong. Tonight, those whispers finally became certainty. Lady Victoria Holloway stood beside him. At 24, Victoria was considered one of the wealthiest unmarried women in England. Her father owned shipping interests that stretched across oceans. Her inheritance alone could rescue struggling estates and secure political ambitions. She was beautiful in the way society admired. Golden-haired. Fashionable. Effortlessly confident. Charlotte watched Victoria place a gloved hand lightly upon Ethan's sleeve. Ethan did not move away. Instead, he lowered his head and said something that made Victoria laugh. Charlotte could not hear the words. She did not need to. Miss Ashford, a familiar voice asked beside her. Charlotte turned. Her closest friend, Emily Pembroke, was studying her with concern. You look pale. Charlotte forced a smile. I am perfectly well. Emily followed her gaze across the ballroom. The concern in her expression deepened. Charlotte? Please do not. Charlotte kept her voice calm. Not tonight. Emily hesitated before nodding. Of course. Charlotte appreciated the kindness. She appreciated it even more because Emily's silence confirmed her fears. Others had noticed. Others had seen whatever was unfolding between Ethan and Victoria. Perhaps she was the last person in London to understand what was happening. The realization stung more than she cared to admit. A gentleman approaching the musicians requested a new waltz. The orchestra shifted seamlessly into another melody. Couples began moving toward the center of the ballroom. Charlotte glanced toward the entrance. Ethan had promised her this dance. The promise now seemed almost laughable. Several minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. Ethan never came. Around her, conversations flowed. Laughter echoed softly beneath the chandeliers. Charlotte remained standing near a marble column, determined not to show disappointment. Years of aristocratic upbringing had taught her many things. One of them was how to suffer quietly. Unfortunately, that skill was becoming increasingly useful. There you are. Charlotte turned at the sound of her mother's voice. Lady Ashford approached with graceful urgency. Her expression was pleasant enough for observers. Charlotte recognized the tension hidden beneath it. Your father wishes to speak with you. Has something happened? Lady Ashford hesitated. The brief pause was answer enough. Come with me, darling. A strange calm settled over Charlotte as they crossed the ballroom. Perhaps because some part of her already knew the worst was coming. They entered a smaller drawing room adjoining the main assembly. The noise of the party faded behind closed doors. Lord Ashford stood near the fireplace. Ethan was there as well. So was Victoria Holloway and her father. Charlotte stopped walking. No one spoke immediately. The silence stretched. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Final. Ethan cleared his throat. Charlotte. She almost smiled. After 18 months of engagement, he sounded as though he were addressing an acquaintance. Mr. Fairmorn. His expression flickered. The formal address clearly unsettled him. Good. For once, she was glad. Victoria remained silent. Lord Holloway appeared mildly embarrassed. Charlotte's father looked furious. Ethan drew a breath. I had hoped to speak with you privately. Then perhaps you should have done so before bringing witnesses. Color rose in Ethan's face. Charlotte surprised herself. The words emerged with remarkable composure. Inside, her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Ethan glanced toward Victoria before looking back at Charlotte. That single glance told her everything. I cannot marry you. There it was. Simple. Direct. Brutal. Charlotte stared at him. Not because she had not expected the words. Because hearing them spoken aloud somehow made them real. Ethan continued. Circumstances have changed. Circumstances. Charlotte repeated the word carefully. How unfortunate. Lady Ashford inhaled sharply. Lord Ashford's jaw tightened. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. I never intended to cause pain. Charlotte almost laughed. Instead, she folded her hands neatly before her. Then this must be an extraordinary accident. Victoria finally spoke. Miss Ashford, I assure you. Charlotte turned toward her. Victoria immediately fell silent. The look Charlotte gave her contained no anger. Somehow that made it worse. There is no need for assurances. Charlotte said quietly. The situation appears quite clear. Ethan looked relieved. As though her composure made everything easier. As though dignity somehow reduced humiliation. He was mistaken. It simply concealed it. Victoria and I intend to marry. The words landed with remarkable force. Not because they surprised Charlotte. Because they confirmed that every whispered rumor had been true. Ethan had not merely ended an engagement. He had replaced her. Lord Ashford stepped forward. You gave your word. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. I understand your disappointment. Disappointment. Lord Ashford repeated. You have publicly compromised my daughter's reputation. Father. Charlotte's voice was gentle. Please. Her father fell silent. Ethan looked grateful again. Charlotte wished he would stop. Gratitude from him felt insulting now. She looked directly at the man she had once imagined spending her life with. Strangely, the grief she expected had not arrived. Not yet. What she felt instead was exhaustion. The exhaustion of finally understanding something she had been fighting to deny. When did you decide? She asked. Ethan hesitated. The answer alone was revealing. Several months ago. Charlotte nodded. Months. While writing affectionate letters. While discussing wedding plans. While allowing her to believe their future remained intact. Months. I see. Victoria shifted awkwardly. Perhaps she expected tears. Perhaps everyone did. Charlotte had none to offer. Then I wish you both every happiness. Ethan blinked. Charlotte? You have made your choice. Her voice remained steady. I would prefer not to prolong an uncomfortable conversation. For a moment no one moved. Then Charlotte curtsied politely. Turned. And walked out of the room. She did not run. She did not cry. She crossed the ballroom with perfect posture and calm dignity while hundreds of guests continued enjoying the evening. Only when she reached the terrace overlooking the gardens did she allow herself to breathe. Cool night air greeted her. London spread beyond the estate in a sea of distant lights. Charlotte gripped the stone balustrade and stared into the darkness. Somewhere behind her, the party continued. She wondered how long it would take for the news to spread. An hour. Perhaps less. By morning, half of London would know. By next week, everyone would. The abandoned fiancé. The woman who lost her future to a richer rival. The story practically wrote itself. A small sound escaped her throat. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a sob. Miss Ashford. Charlotte turned sharply. A gentleman stood several yards away near the shadowed entrance to the terrace. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Immaculately dressed in black evening attire. For a brief moment she did not recognize him. Then the moonlight shifted. Alexander Ravenshire. Duke of Ravenshire. One of the most powerful men in England. Charlotte had seen him before at various social events. Never closely. Never personally. Society described him as cold, distant, impossible to impress. He rarely attended gatherings. When he did, he usually left early. Yet here he was. Standing alone. Watching her. Charlotte immediately straightened. Your Grace. He inclined his head. Forgive the intrusion. His voice was deep and controlled. I was already here when you arrived. Charlotte suddenly realized how vulnerable she must appear. Alone. Freshly humiliated. Fighting back tears. She hated it. Then I shall leave you in peace. She turned to go. You have no reason to feel ashamed. The word stopped her. Charlotte looked back. Alexander's expression remained unreadable. I beg your pardon. What happened tonight reflects upon Mr. Fairmorn. His gaze never left hers. Not upon you. Charlotte stared. Most people offered sympathy. The Duke offered certainty. Somehow there was a difference. For the first time that evening, the pressure behind her eyes became dangerous. Thank you, Your Grace. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. So slightly that she wondered whether she imagined it. Good evening, Miss Ashford. Charlotte inclined her head and returned inside. She did not see Alexander remain where he was long after she left. She did not see the way his gaze followed her through the ballroom. She did not hear the quiet conversation that occurred later that night between the Duke and his private secretary. Nor did she know that Ethan Fairmont's name was already written inside a leather-bound file resting upon a desk in Ravenshire House. As Charlotte climbed into her family's carriage shortly before midnight, she believed only one chapter of her life had ended. She had no idea another had already begun. For 3 days, Charlotte Ashford became the most discussed woman in London. Not the most admired. Not the most envied. Merely the most discussed. Society had a remarkable talent for transforming private heartbreak into public entertainment. By the end of the week, every drawing room in Mayfair seemed to possess its own version of the story. Some claimed Ethan Fairmorn had discovered Charlotte was secretly in debt. Others insisted Lord Ashford had attempted to force an unsuitable marriage. A few particularly imaginative storytellers suggested Charlotte herself had ended the engagement in a fit of pride. The truth mattered far less than the spectacle. Charlotte learned this quickly. She also learned that pity could be more exhausting than cruelty. At least cruelty was honest. Pity arrived disguised as kindness. It appeared in lowered voices, sympathetic glances, and carefully chosen words that only highlighted her humiliation. On Thursday afternoon, Charlotte accompanied her mother to a charitable luncheon hosted by Lady Worthington. Under ordinary circumstances, attendance would have been unavoidable. After recent events, it felt like a public trial. The drawing room was crowded with fashionable ladies draped in silks and jewels. Conversations drifted between philanthropy, politics, and upcoming social events. The moment Charlotte entered, a subtle shift passed through the room. Nothing obvious. Nothing that violated etiquette. Yet she felt it immediately. Several conversations paused. Heads turned. Eyes lingered. Then everyone pretended not to stare. Lady Ashford squeezed her daughter's arm. Hold your head high. Charlotte managed a small smile. I intend to. She did exactly that. For nearly 2 hours she navigated polite conversations, accepted sympathetic remarks, and ignored whispered observations she was clearly not meant to hear. By the time the luncheon ended, she felt as though she had survived a military campaign. The carriage ride home was blissfully quiet. Rain tapped gently against the windows. London disappeared behind a curtain of grey mist. Charlotte leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes. "You handled yourself beautifully," Lady Ashford said softly. Charlotte laughed. "That is a generous interpretation." "It is an accurate one." Her mother hesitated. "Your father is worried." Charlotte opened her eyes. "About me?" "About the future." That required no further explanation. The broken engagement had damaged more than Charlotte's heart. It had damaged her prospects. In Victorian society, reputation possessed tremendous value. An abandoned fiancé was not ruined, but neither was she untouched. Suitors tended to prefer women without public disappointments attached to their names. Charlotte looked out the window again. "I shall survive." Her mother reached for her hand. "I know you will." The answer should have comforted her. Instead, it made her unexpectedly emotional. Because her mother sounded certain. More certain than Charlotte felt herself. Across London, in a townhouse overlooking Grosvenor Square, another conversation was taking place. Alexander Ravenshire stood near the window of his private study. Rain streaked the glass. The room behind him glowed with the warm light of several lamps. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Books, legal documents, estate records, and correspondence occupied nearly every available surface. It was the office of a man accustomed to responsibility. A knock sounded at the door. "Enter." Nathaniel Pierce stepped inside carrying several folders. At 40 years old, he had served as the Duke's private secretary for nearly a decade. He was discreet, intelligent, and remarkably difficult to surprise. Yet even he appeared slightly puzzled by recent instructions. "The information you requested, Your Grace." Alexander accepted the documents. "Thank you." Nathaniel remained standing. Alexander glanced up. "Something else?" "May I ask a question?" Alexander returned his attention to the papers. "You may." "Will you answer it?" A faint smile touched Alexander's mouth. "That depends entirely on the question." Nathaniel considered his words carefully. "Why are we investigating Ethan Fairmorn?" Silence followed. Rain continued tapping against the windows. Alexander slowly closed the folder. "You believe it unnecessary." "I believe it unusual." Nathaniel chose diplomacy. "Mr. Fairmorn possesses no significant political influence. No business dealings affecting your estates. No connection to Parliament. Until last week, he was entirely unremarkable." Alexander moved toward the fireplace. Flames danced behind the iron grate. "And now?" Nathaniel studied him. "Now he appears to have your attention." Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, he picked up another folder and opened it. Several financial records rested inside. "What did you discover?" Nathaniel recognized a change of subject. He accepted it gracefully. Several questionable investments. A considerable amount of debt. Nothing illegal. Merely reckless. Alexander nodded. That confirmed earlier suspicions. "Continue." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "You expect more." "I do." "Why?" Alexander finally looked at him. His expression remained calm. Controlled. Entirely unreadable. Because men rarely abandon an advantageous engagement without reason. Nathaniel accepted the explanation. Outwardly, it sounded logical. Internally, he remained unconvinced. Something else was happening. He simply could not determine what. After Nathaniel departed, Alexander returned to the window. Below, carriages moved through rain-soaked streets. London carried on with its endless rhythm. His thoughts drifted elsewhere. To a ballroom. A terrace. Grey eyes filled with wounded dignity. He closed the folder. The truth was more complicated than his secretary realized. Much more complicated. Alexander had first noticed Charlotte Ashford for years earlier. Not because she was exceptionally beautiful, although she possessed a quiet elegance many overlooked. Not because she sought attention. She rarely did. He noticed her because she behaved differently from everyone around her. Their first encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes. A charity auction held in support of several schools outside London. Most guests attended because society expected it. Charlotte attended because she genuinely cared. Alexander remembered standing near the rear of the room while committee members discussed fundraising goals. Most participants contributed polite comments before returning to social conversation. Charlotte had spoken for nearly 10 minutes about educational opportunities for children in rural communities. She had spoken intelligently, passionately, without realizing one of England's most powerful men was listening nearby. Alexander remembered finding that refreshing. He had encountered countless beautiful women. Genuine conviction was considerably rarer. The memory lingered. Then another followed. A dinner party 18 months later. Charlotte discussing literature with an elderly professor everyone else ignored. A winter charity event where she spent half the evening helping organize donations instead of seeking advantageous introductions. Small moments. Individually insignificant. Together, memorable. Alexander had never acted upon those observations. He had no reason to. Charlotte became engaged to Ethan Fairmorn. Alexander accepted the news with far less indifference than he expected. Life continued. Responsibilities accumulated. Estates required management. Parliament demanded attention. Years passed. Then last week happened. He looked down at the folder in his hands. Ethan Fairmorn. For reasons Alexander could not entirely explain, the name irritated him. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter. This time it was his mother. Dowager Duchess Eleanor Ravenshire swept into the room with the confidence of someone entirely unconcerned by titles, rank, or authority. At 62, she remained formidable. Alexander respected very few people. His mother was one of them. You are working again. She glanced toward the documents. How shocking. Alexander smiled faintly. Good afternoon, Mother. Good afternoon. She settled into a nearby chair. Now tell me why you have spent 3 evenings investigating another woman's former fiancé. Alexander sighed. Nathaniel talks too much. Nathaniel talks exactly enough. Eleanor adjusted her gloves. The question remains. Alexander returned the folder to his desk. You are imagining things. Alexander. His mother raised one eyebrow. I gave birth to you. Do not insult us both. Silence stretched. Then Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Is it the Ashford girl? Alexander looked toward the fire. That alone provided an answer. Eleanor's expression changed. Interest replaced amusement. Well. She sounded almost pleased. That is unexpected. Nothing is happening. Of course not. She nodded solemnly. You are merely conducting investigations regarding men who humiliate her? Entirely unrelated. Alexander laughed despite himself. Eleanor rarely missed details. Mother. I have been waiting 10 years to see you interested in anyone. Interested is a strong word. Then what word would you prefer? Alexander did not answer. Eleanor watched him carefully. For the first time, she noticed something unusual. Not love. Not yet. But concern. Attention. Perhaps even admiration. Significant developments for a man who treated most social interactions like unpleasant obligations. She handled herself remarkably well. Eleanor said quietly. Alexander looked up. You were there. Naturally. Half of London was there. Eleanor's expression softened. The poor girl deserved better. Alexander agreed. He simply did not say so aloud. Several days later, Charlotte attended Sunday services with her family. The church stood just beyond the edge of Mayfair. Respectable. Traditional. Familiar. Exactly the sort of place where one hoped to avoid unwanted attention. Unfortunately, hope and reality rarely cooperated. As Charlotte exited after the service, she immediately spotted Victoria Holloway surrounded by acquaintances near the front steps. Ethan stood beside her. The sight struck harder than expected. Not because Charlotte missed him. Because they looked happy. Effortlessly happy. Victoria noticed Charlotte at the same moment. Their eyes met. For one brief second, genuine discomfort crossed Victoria's face. Then it vanished beneath practiced confidence. Charlotte kept walking. Head high. Expression composed. She would not create a scene. She would not offer society additional entertainment. She reached her family's carriage and climbed inside. Only then did she release the breath she had been holding. Through the window, she watched Ethan help Victoria into another carriage. He looked content. Entirely content. Strange how quickly people moved forward. The carriage began rolling away. Charlotte turned her gaze toward the passing streets. She did not notice another carriage positioned farther down the road. She did not notice the tall gentleman seated inside watching from behind a rain-speckled window. Alexander Ravenshire lowered the curtain after her carriage disappeared from view. Opposite him sat Nathaniel Pierce. The secretary studied his employer with growing curiosity. Coincidence? Nathaniel asked. Alexander's expression remained neutral. What is? Attending this particular church. Alexander looked out the window. I have attended for years. Nathaniel nodded. Of course. Neither man said another word. Yet as the carriage carried them back toward Ravenshire House, Nathaniel became increasingly certain of one thing. Whatever had begun on that terrace several nights ago was not ending anytime soon. And somewhere deep inside, Alexander suspected the same. He simply was not ready to admit it. 1 month after her broken engagement, Charlotte Ashford had mastered the art of appearing unaffected. It was a useful skill. Unfortunately, it was also exhausting. Every morning she rose at the same hour. Every afternoon she fulfilled social obligations. Every evening she smiled through conversations she no longer enjoyed. London gradually found new scandals to discuss. Fresh engagements were announced. Political disagreements emerged. New gossip replaced old gossip. Yet Charlotte remained aware of the subtle difference in how society regarded her now. She was no longer simply Miss Ashford. She was Miss Ashford who had been left behind. The distinction followed her everywhere. On a bright morning in late May, Charlotte sat beside the window of her family's drawing room sorting correspondence for her father. Sunlight streamed across the carpet. Outside, carriages rolled steadily along the street. The city seemed unusually cheerful. Charlotte found the optimism slightly irritating. You have been staring at that letter for 5 minutes. Charlotte glanced up. Her younger cousin, Margaret Ellis, stood in the doorway holding a basket of flowers. At 21, Margaret possessed the kind of enthusiasm that survived nearly every disappointment. Charlotte envied it. I was thinking. Margaret entered the room. Dangerous habit. Charlotte laughed despite herself. You sound exactly like my father. That is alarming. I apologize immediately. Margaret settled into a nearby chair. Her expression softened. You seem better. Charlotte considered the observation. I think I am. It was mostly true. The sharpest pain had faded. What remained felt more manageable. Less like a wound. More like a scar. Still visible. Still sensitive. No longer devastating. Margaret nodded approvingly. Good. Because I have news. Charlotte immediately looked suspicious. That tone never leads anywhere sensible. Lady Worthington is hosting a garden reception next week. Charlotte groaned. Margaret ignored her? Half of London will attend. An excellent reason to avoid it. Charlotte. Margaret smiled. You are going. Charlotte returned her attention to the letters. I am not. You are. I am not. You are. Charlotte finally laughed. Margaret's victory was immediate. There. That laugh proves I am right. Charlotte shook her head. For the first time in weeks, the future felt slightly less bleak. Across the city, Alexander Ravenshire sat through a meeting he barely heard. Several estate managers occupied chairs around a large conference table inside Ravenshire House. Financial reports covered nearly every surface. Discussions regarding tenant improvements, crop yields, and infrastructure projects continued steadily. Normally Alexander excelled during such meetings. Today his concentration drifted. Nathaniel Pierce noticed immediately. The secretary rarely missed details. "The Hampshire figures, Your Grace." Alexander blinked. "Pardon?" Several men exchanged discreet glances. Nathaniel repeated the question. Alexander answered appropriately. The discussion resumed. Yet a few minutes later his attention wandered again. Nathaniel waited patiently until the meeting ended. Once the final manager departed, he closed the door and turned toward his employer. "You are distracted." Alexander removed his spectacles and set them aside. "Am I?" "Painfully so." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "Perhaps I am tired." Nathaniel folded his arms. "Would you like me to pretend I believe that?" A faint smile appeared. "No." Silence lingered. Then Nathaniel spoke carefully. "You have spent a month investigating Ethan Fairmorn. And thus far you have discovered nothing worthy of such attention." Alexander rose and crossed toward the window. "Not yet." Nathaniel watched him. "What exactly are you looking for?" The question lingered in the room. Alexander considered several possible answers. None felt entirely honest. Finally he settled upon the simplest. "The truth." Nathaniel frowned. "About what?" Alexander looked out toward the city. "Everything." That answer explained very little. Yet Nathaniel sensed further questions would accomplish nothing. Some realizations arrived only when people were prepared to face them. Alexander, it seemed, was not there yet. 3 days later, Charlotte attended Lady Worthington's reception despite her earlier objections. The event occupied the gardens of an impressive estate near Hyde Park. White tents dotted the grounds. Musicians played beneath flowering trees. Elegant guests wandered among fountains and carefully arranged flowerbeds. It was precisely the sort of gathering Charlotte once enjoyed. Today she approached it with caution. "You are frowning." Margaret appeared beside her carrying lemonade. Charlotte accepted the glass. "I am observing." "You are frowning while observing." Charlotte smiled. "Perhaps slightly." Margaret lowered her voice. "Nobody is staring." Charlotte knew that was not entirely true. Several people had already offered sympathetic greetings. Others watched discreetly from a distance. Yet Margaret's point remained valid. The world had not ended. Life continued. Charlotte took a slow breath. For the first time, she allowed herself to relax. The afternoon passed pleasantly. She spoke with acquaintances. Discussed books with an elderly scholar. Helped organize donations for a local orphanage. The familiar activities reminded her of who she had been before public embarrassment reshaped her social identity. Near sunset, guests gradually gathered near the main terrace where refreshments were being served. Charlotte stood speaking with Lady Worthington when a sudden ripple of excitement spread through the crowd. Conversation softened. Heads turned toward the entrance. Charlotte followed the movement instinctively. A carriage had just arrived. Moments later, a tall figure emerged. Alexander Ravenshire. Even before anyone announced his name, people recognized him. Wealth and power carried their own unmistakable presence. The Duke moved through the gathering with characteristic composure. Gentlemen greeted him respectfully. Mothers with unmarried daughters suddenly became much more attentive. Young women adjusted ribbons and curls. Charlotte watched for only a moment before returning her attention elsewhere. She had no reason to think about the Duke. Yet somehow she became aware of him several times throughout the evening. A brief conversation near the fountain. A glimpse of him speaking with Lady Worthington. A distant figure crossing the lawn. Nothing unusual. Nothing significant. Still, she noticed. The realization annoyed her slightly. Later, as twilight settled across the gardens, Charlotte wandered toward a quieter section of the estate. A small path wound between flowering hedges. Birds sang from nearby trees. The peaceful atmosphere felt like a welcome escape from crowded social obligations. She was examining a cluster of roses when footsteps approached. Miss Ashford. Charlotte turned. Surprise immediately followed. Alexander Ravenshire stood several feet away. For one absurd moment she wondered whether she had somehow imagined him into existence. Your Grace. He inclined his head. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Merely unexpected. Charlotte searched for something appropriate to say. Alexander solved the problem first. The roses appear to have your full attention. Charlotte glanced at the flowers. They are considerably less complicated than society. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Close enough. A reasonable observation. Charlotte relaxed slightly. To her surprise, conversation came easily. They discussed books. Charitable projects. The reception itself. Nothing personal. Nothing improper. Yet the exchange felt refreshingly genuine. Alexander listened carefully. He never interrupted. He never spoke merely to hear himself speak. Charlotte found that unexpectedly rare. Time passed without either noticing. Eventually she became aware of approaching voices somewhere beyond the hedges. Several ladies were strolling nearby. Charlotte instinctively stepped back. Appearances mattered. Alexander understood immediately. I should not compromise your reputation further. Charlotte looked at him. That would require a reputation worth compromising. The words escaped before she could stop them. Regret followed instantly. Alexander's expression changed. Something sharpened in his eyes. Miss Ashford. His voice was quiet. You underestimate your own value. Charlotte looked away. No one had said anything like that in months. Perhaps years. The sincerity behind the statement unsettled her more than flattery ever could. Before she could respond, approaching footsteps grew louder. The moment dissolved. Alexander straightened slightly. Enjoy the remainder of the evening. Thank you, Your Grace. He hesitated. Just briefly. Then he said something that would remain with her long afterward. Other people making poor choices does not diminish your worth. Charlotte stared at him. Alexander inclined his head and walked away. She remained standing among the roses long after he disappeared. That night, back at Ravenshire House, Alexander entered his study shortly before midnight. A letter rested upon his desk. Nathaniel had left it earlier. Alexander opened the envelope. Several pages of financial information emerged. He read silently. Then again. His expression hardened. For the first time in weeks, something substantial had finally surfaced. Ethan Fairmont's debts were considerably larger than previously reported. More troubling still, several transactions connected indirectly to investments controlled by Lord Holloway. Victoria Holloway's father. Alexander slowly lowered the documents. The coincidence felt improbable. His instincts rarely failed him. Tonight they were shouting. A knock sounded. Nathaniel entered. You wish to see me? Alexander handed him the papers. Nathaniel scanned the contents. His eyebrows rose. Interesting. Very. Nathaniel looked up. Do you think it is connected? Alexander moved toward the fireplace. Flames reflected in his eyes. I think Mr. Fairmont may have had more reasons for ending his engagement than society realizes. Nathaniel studied him carefully. And if that proves true? Alexander's gaze settled upon the dancing firelight. His answer came slowly. Deliberately. Then someone has been lying. Neither man spoke afterward. Yet somewhere in London, entirely unaware of the investigation unfolding around her, Charlotte Ashford prepared for bed believing the worst chapter of her life was already behind her. She did not know that hidden beneath polite smiles, financial records, and carefully guarded secrets, another story was only beginning to reveal itself. The proposal arrived on a Tuesday morning wrapped in cream-colored stationery bearing the Ravenshire crest. Charlotte noticed the seal before she noticed the handwriting. That alone was enough to make her pause. She had been sitting beside the drawing-room window reviewing correspondence with her mother when the footman delivered the letter on a silver tray. Lady Ashford glanced at the crest and frowned slightly. "That is unexpected." Charlotte agreed. Nothing in her recent conversations with Alexander Ravenshire suggested formal correspondence. Certainly nothing that required a personal letter delivered directly to her family residence. She carefully broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The message was brief, direct, entirely characteristic of its author. "Miss Ashford, I would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with you privately regarding a matter of importance. If convenient, I shall call upon your family this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Respectfully, Alexander Ravenshire." Charlotte read the note twice. Then a third time. Her mother watched silently. "What does he want?" Lady Ashford finally asked. Charlotte lowered the paper. "I have absolutely no idea." By 2:30, curiosity had transformed into nervous anticipation. Charlotte disliked not knowing what awaited her. She disliked it even more because she found herself caring about the answer. When Alexander's carriage finally appeared outside the townhouse, her pulse quickened despite her best efforts. The Duke arrived precisely on time. Of course he did. Everything about Alexander suggested a man who respected order. He entered the drawing-room with his usual calm confidence. Tall. Impeccably dressed. Entirely composed. Lord Ashford greeted him politely. Lady Ashford did the same. After several minutes of formal conversation, Alexander turned toward Charlotte. "May I request a private discussion with Miss Ashford?" The room became very quiet. Charlotte felt her father's attention sharpen instantly. In Victorian society, such requests were not made lightly. Alexander remained perfectly calm. Lord Ashford studied him for several seconds before nodding. "You may use the library." Moments later, Charlotte found herself alone with Alexander inside the Ashford library. Sunlight filtered through tall windows. Shelves filled with books lined the walls. The familiar surroundings should have been comforting. Instead, they somehow heightened the significance of the moment. Alexander remained standing near the fireplace. Charlotte settled into a chair opposite him. "Your note was mysterious." Alexander's expression softened slightly. "That was not my intention." Then perhaps clarity would be helpful. For a brief moment, something resembling uncertainty crossed his face. It disappeared so quickly she almost believed she imagined it. Alexander Ravenshire did not seem like a man who experienced uncertainty. "You are correct." He drew a slow breath. Then he spoke words Charlotte never could have anticipated. "I would like you to marry me." Silence followed. Complete and absolute. Charlotte stared at him. The library seemed strangely distant. Even the ticking clock on the mantelpiece sounded unreal. "I beg your pardon." Alexander held her gaze. "I am asking you to become my wife." Charlotte blinked once. Twice. The words refused to arrange themselves into anything sensible. "The Duke of Ravenshire is proposing marriage to me." "Yes." "Today." "Yes." Charlotte rose slowly from her chair. Walking felt easier than standing still. She crossed toward the nearest window and looked out at the street below. Carriages passed. Pedestrians moved along the sidewalk. The world remained perfectly normal despite the fact that nothing felt normal anymore. "Why?" she asked quietly. Alexander did not answer immediately. "Because I respect you." Charlotte turned. Respect is not usually sufficient reason for marriage. It is a better foundation than many alternatives. That was difficult to argue with. Charlotte folded her arms. "You barely know me." I know more than you realize. The answer caught her attention. Alexander seemed to recognize it instantly. Some emotion flickered across his face. Regret, perhaps. Or caution. What does that mean? Charlotte asked. It means I have observed your character for several years. Charlotte stared. Observed? At social functions. Charitable events. Public gatherings. His voice remained calm. You consistently demonstrate intelligence, compassion, and integrity. No one had ever described her quite like that before. Not even Ethan. Especially not Ethan. The realization was unexpectedly painful. Alexander continued. I admire those qualities. Charlotte looked away. Compliments from most gentlemen felt rehearsed. These did not. Perhaps because Alexander sounded as though he meant every word. This still makes very little sense. A faint smile appeared. I suspected you would say that. Charlotte laughed despite herself. Then the reality of the situation returned. Your Grace, London will think you have lost your mind. London frequently thinks many things. They will assume you pity me. Alexander's expression immediately hardened. I do not pity you. The certainty in his voice startled her. Then why now? She pressed. Why not 6 months ago? Why not next year? Alexander was silent for several moments. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. More personal. Because life rarely provides guarantees. Charlotte felt something shift between them. Not dramatically. Subtly. As though she had glimpsed a deeper truth hidden beneath carefully controlled words. Yet before she could explore it, Alexander continued. I am not offering a romantic fantasy. His honesty was almost shocking. I cannot promise perfect happiness. I cannot promise that every day will be easy. Charlotte listened carefully. What can you promise? Respect. The answer came immediately. Protection. Loyalty. Honesty. He paused. And a partnership in which your thoughts and opinions matter. Charlotte's throat tightened unexpectedly. Those promises sounded simple. Yet they represented things many women never received. Alexander stepped slightly closer. Not enough to feel improper. Just enough to emphasize the sincerity of what followed. I believe we would make an excellent team. Team. Not possession. Not ornament. Not obligation. Team. Charlotte suddenly understood why this conversation felt so different from every courtship discussion she had ever experienced. Alexander was not evaluating her suitability. He was offering equality. As much equality as Victorian society allowed. It was an extraordinary gift. And somehow that made the decision even harder. I need time. Of course. Relief flashed briefly across his face. As though he had feared immediate refusal. The realization surprised her. Take whatever time you require. He moved toward the door. Then stopped. There is one more thing. Charlotte looked up. If you decline, nothing changes. His gaze remained steady. You will continue to have my respect. After he left, Charlotte remained in the library for nearly an hour. By evening, her parents knew everything. Lord Ashford reacted with stunned disbelief. Lady Ashford with cautious hope. Neither attempted to pressure her. For that, Charlotte was grateful. Yet over the following days, the proposal occupied every waking thought. Logic argued one thing. Emotion another. She respected Alexander. She trusted him more than seemed reasonable. Yet marriage was forever. Eventually, she requested another meeting. This time Alexander invited her to Ravenshire House. The residence occupied one of the most prestigious addresses in London. Elegant without being ostentatious. Impressive without feeling cold. Charlotte quickly realized the house reflected its owner. They spoke for nearly 2 hours inside a private sitting room. About responsibilities. Expectations. Family. Values. The future. Not once did Alexander attempt to persuade her. He simply answered every question honestly. By the end of the conversation, Charlotte understood something important. She felt safer with him than she had ever felt with Ethan. The realization changed everything. 3 days later, she accepted. The news struck London like a thunderclap. Society could discuss nothing else. The abandoned fiancé was marrying one of England's most powerful dukes. Invitations, rumours, speculation, and endless theories spread across every drawing room in the city. Many people were shocked. Some were delighted. A few were openly jealous. Charlotte ignored all of it. The wedding took place 6 weeks later at a private chapel in Hampshire. The ceremony was elegant but restrained. No extravagant spectacle. No dramatic declarations. Just family, close friends, and sacred vows exchanged beneath stained glass windows glowing with summer light. As Charlotte stood beside Alexander at the altar, she experienced a strange sense of calm. Not certainty. Not yet. But peace. The kind that comes when stepping into an unknown future with someone whose character has already proven itself. When the ceremony ended and the congregation began to disperse, Alexander offered her his arm. Charlotte accepted it. They walked together toward the chapel doors. Husband and wife. The title felt unfamiliar. So did the future waiting beyond those doors. Yet as sunlight spilled across the stone steps and the gathered guests looked on, Charlotte realized something remarkable. For the first time in many months, she was no longer looking backward. She was finally moving forward. Unaware that somewhere behind the polished dignity of her new husband, hidden beneath years of restraint and carefully guarded secrets, truth remained waiting to be discovered. The first week of marriage felt strangely peaceful. Charlotte had expected awkwardness. She had expected uncertainty. She had even expected occasional regret. Instead, what she encountered was stability. Ravenshire Manor stood several miles outside a picturesque Hampshire village. The estate stretched across rolling green hills, ancient woodlands, and carefully maintained gardens. Every morning sunlight poured through enormous windows overlooking the countryside. Every evening the manor settled into a quiet rhythm that felt entirely different from London's endless social demands. Yet if peace existed within the estate, mystery existed within her husband. Charlotte noticed it almost immediately. Alexander was never unkind. Never distant in a cruel sense. He treated her with unwavering respect. He listened when she spoke. He consulted her opinions regarding household matters. He made certain every servant treated her as the unquestioned Duchess of Ravenshire. In many ways, he was exactly the man he had promised to be. And yet something remained hidden behind those calm grey eyes. Charlotte could feel it. She simply could not identify it. One morning, nearly 3 weeks after their wedding, she entered the breakfast room to find Alexander already seated at the long mahogany table. Sunlight illuminated several newspapers spread before him. A cup of coffee rested untouched beside his plate. Charlotte noticed the newspapers first. Then she noticed the expression on his face. Focused. Intent. Unusually severe. He immediately folded one of the papers the moment she entered. The movement was subtle. Almost invisible. Yet Charlotte saw it. Good morning. Alexander rose as she approached. Did you sleep well? Very well. She accepted the chair he pulled out for her. And you? Perfectly. Charlotte studied him for a moment. You appear busy. A few estate matters. His answer came smoothly. Too smoothly. The conversation continued. Pleasant. Ordinary. Yet Charlotte found herself wondering about the folded newspaper. Why hide it? More importantly, why did he look relieved when she stopped asking questions? Later that afternoon, while exploring a section of the manor she had not yet visited, Charlotte discovered Alexander's private study. She had seen the room before. She simply had never entered while he was absent. The door stood partially open. Curiosity tugged gently at her. Not because she intended to invade his privacy. Because she wanted to understand the man she had married. The room reflected Alexander perfectly. Orderly. Elegant. Efficient. Shelves lined with books occupied one wall. Maps and estate records filled another. Large windows overlooked the western gardens. Everything appeared meticulously organized. Charlotte smiled slightly. Nothing about the study surprised her. Then she noticed a leather folder resting upon the corner of the desk. It was not the folder itself that caught her attention. It was the name written across the front. Ethan Fairmorn. Charlotte froze. For several seconds she simply stared. Surely she was mistaken. Yet when she stepped closer, the name remained exactly where she had first seen it. Ethan Fairmorn. Her former fiancé. Confusion immediately replaced surprise. Why would Alexander possess documents regarding Ethan? More importantly, why would those documents still be here months after the broken engagement? Charlotte glanced toward the open doorway. The hallway remained empty. Her pulse quickened. Every lesson regarding propriety urged her to leave immediately. Every instinct urging caution told her the same thing. Yet another feeling proved stronger. Curiosity. She carefully opened the folder. Inside rested financial reports, correspondence copies, and several pages filled with handwritten notes. Charlotte scanned the documents. Most contained information she did not fully understand. Investments. Debts. Business transactions. Dates. Names. Account summaries. Yet one fact became immediately clear. Someone had been investigating Ethan extensively. Her heart began beating faster. Why? She turned another page. Then another. Several references to Lord Holloway appeared repeatedly. Victoria Holloway's father. Charlotte frowned. The connection seemed significant. Before she could examine further, footsteps echoed somewhere in the hallway. She immediately closed the folder and stepped away from the desk. A moment later, Mrs. Whittaker, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway. Your Grace. Charlotte forced a calm smile. Mrs. Whittaker. The older woman inclined her head politely. I hope I am not interrupting. Not at all. Charlotte moved toward the door. I was simply exploring. Mrs. Whittaker smiled warmly. The manor can be surprisingly large for newcomers. Charlotte laughed softly. I am beginning to realize that. Yet as she followed the housekeeper down the corridor, her thoughts remained trapped inside the study. Inside that folder. Inside questions she could not answer. That evening during dinner, Charlotte found herself watching Alexander more closely than usual. Candlelight flickered across polished silver and crystal glassware. The dining room felt intimate despite its size. Several courses came and went. Conversation remained pleasant. Yet Charlotte could not stop thinking about the document she had seen. Finally she set down her fork. May I ask you something? Alexander immediately looked up. Always. Charlotte hesitated. Have you maintained contact with Mr. Fairmorn? The reaction was almost imperceptible. Almost. Alexander's hand paused briefly against the stem of his glass. Then the moment disappeared. No. Charlotte watched him carefully. You have not spoken to him. Not recently. Not recently. The wording struck her immediately. But you have spoken to him. Alexander met her gaze. Calm. Controlled. Impossible to read. On occasion. Charlotte felt her confusion deepen. Why? Silence lingered. Not uncomfortable. Merely thoughtful. Alexander finally placed his glass upon the table. Certain matters required clarification. What matters? His eyes held hers. For a brief moment, Charlotte believed he might answer honestly. Instead he said, nothing that concerns you. The response irritated her. More than it should have. If it concerns my former fiancé, it concerns me at least a little. Something unexpected happened then. Alexander's expression softened. Not with amusement. With understanding. That is fair. Charlotte waited. Alexander looked toward the fireplace before speaking again. I am attempting to understand several business arrangements connected to Lord Holloway. Charlotte blinked. That answer was not what she expected. Victoria's father. Yes. What does that have to do with Ethan? Alexander's gaze settled on hers once more. That is precisely the question. Charlotte felt a chill move through her chest. Not fear. Unease. Something about Alexander's certainty suggested he already suspected the answer. After dinner ended, she retired to her sitting room more unsettled than before. Rain tapped softly against the windows. A book rested unopened in her lap. Her thoughts remained elsewhere. Why investigate Ethan? Why investigate Lord Holloway? Why continue months after the engagement ended? Most troubling of all, why had Alexander begun the investigation before proposing marriage? Because Charlotte was increasingly certain of one thing. The timeline did not make sense. The following afternoon brought another surprise. Charlotte was walking through the rose gardens when she noticed two men speaking quietly near the stables. One was Alexander. The other she recognized immediately. Nathaniel Pierce, Alexander's secretary. They appeared deeply engaged in conversation. Charlotte had no intention of eavesdropping. Yet as she approached, several words drifted clearly across the garden path. The account records match. Nathaniel's voice remained low. There is no question now. Alexander folded his arms. And the transfers? Exactly where we expected. Charlotte slowed instinctively. Transfers? Records? Alexander spoke next. Continue digging. Nathaniel nodded. Do you want Mrs. Fairmorn informed? Charlotte stopped walking. Mrs. Fairmorn. Victoria. The name struck her instantly. Before she could process the conversation, Alexander noticed her. Their eyes met across the garden. The discussion ended immediately. Nathaniel excused himself and departed. Charlotte continued toward her husband. Am I interrupting? Alexander shook his head. Not at all. She studied him carefully. You seem very interested in the Fairmonts. For the first time since their marriage began, genuine tension appeared between them. Not anger. Not conflict. Simply tension. Alexander looked away briefly toward the distant hills. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. There are things I need to understand. Charlotte stepped closer. And if you discover them? Alexander's expression became unreadable once more. Then certain people may owe explanations. The answer lingered between them long after the conversation ended. That night Charlotte lay awake listening to rain against the windows. Sleep refused to come. Every answer seemed to create additional questions. Somewhere within Ravenshire Manor, hidden behind locked drawers, financial reports, and carefully guarded investigations, a truth existed. She could feel it. A truth connecting Ethan, Victoria, Lord Holloway, and somehow, impossibly, Alexander himself. What Charlotte did not yet realize was that the mystery had already become far larger than a broken engagement. And before long, it would change everything she thought she knew about the past. By early autumn, Charlotte had begun to understand the rhythms of Ravenshire Manor. The estate woke with the sunrise and settled into silence long before midnight. Servants moved with quiet efficiency. Tenants arrived with requests and concerns. Estate managers presented reports. Correspondents arrived daily from London. Life possessed a structure she had never fully appreciated before becoming Duchess of Ravenshire. More surprising still, she enjoyed it. Alexander encouraged her involvement in estate matters from the beginning. He never treated her opinions as decorative. When she suggested improvements to a village school, he listened. When she proposed expanding support for several widows living on estate land, he approved additional funding without hesitation. The more time they spent together, the more Charlotte found herself respecting him. Which only made the unanswered questions more difficult to ignore. She still thought about the folder. About Ethan. About Victoria. About the investigation Alexander continued to pursue. Yet she also recognized something else. Whatever motivated him, it was not malice. Alexander simply was not a malicious man. That certainty remained one of the few stable facts she possessed. On a cool October morning, a letter arrived from Lady Worthington inviting them to a harvest celebration in London. The event would gather many of society's most influential families before the social season slowed for winter. Charlotte read the invitation twice before setting it aside. Alexander looked up from his newspaper. "You do not seem enthusiastic." Charlotte smiled faintly. "I have developed a healthy suspicion of large social gatherings." Alexander folded the newspaper. "That is understandable. Are we attending?" "Only if you wish to." Charlotte studied him. Several months into marriage, his habit of offering choices still surprised her. Most men of his rank simply informed their wives of plans. Alexander asked. The difference mattered. Perhaps avoiding society forever is not a realistic strategy. A hint of amusement appeared in his eyes. A wise conclusion. Charlotte sighed dramatically. "I was afraid you would say that." 3 days later, they traveled to London. Ravenshire House welcomed them with the same quiet elegance Charlotte remembered from before their marriage. Servants prepared guest rooms. Footmen carried luggage. The city beyond the windows pulsed with its familiar energy. Yet despite the comfort of the house, Charlotte felt tension building as the evening approached. London meant society. Society meant memories. And memories often meant Ethan and Victoria. By the time they arrived at Lady Worthington's townhouse, the grand ballroom was already crowded. Crystal chandeliers illuminated hundreds of guests. Music floated through the room. Conversations blended into a sophisticated hum. Charlotte accepted Alexander's arm as they entered. The reaction was immediate. Heads turned. Conversation softened. Not because Charlotte was being judged. Because she was arriving beside one of England's most powerful dukes. The contrast was impossible to miss. 6 months earlier she had entered similar rooms as the abandoned fiancé. Tonight she entered as the Duchess of Ravenshire. Society noticed. Society always noticed. "You look nervous." Alexander's voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. Charlotte glanced at him. "Perhaps slightly." "You have no reason to be." The certainty in his tone eased something inside her. They moved through the ballroom together. Greetings were exchanged. Introductions completed. Compliments offered. Charlotte gradually relaxed. Until she saw Victoria Holloway. Or rather, Victoria Fairmorn now. The woman stood near the far side of the room wearing deep emerald silk. Ethan remained beside her. The sight produced an unexpected reaction. Not pain. Not jealousy. Merely discomfort. Like encountering a chapter of her life she no longer wished to reread. Victoria noticed her immediately. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Charlotte expected awkwardness. Perhaps embarrassment. Instead she saw something else. Irritation. The expression vanished quickly. Yet not quickly enough. Charlotte frowned slightly. Why would Victoria be irritated? She was the one who had won. The mystery lingered as the evening progressed. Nearly an hour later, Charlotte found herself speaking with several ladies near the refreshment table when a familiar voice interrupted. "Your Grace." Charlotte turned. Lady Pennington offered a graceful curtsy. Several other women stood nearby. Their smiles appeared friendly enough. Yet something about the atmosphere felt strangely deliberate. "How lovely to see you again." Lady Pennington continued. "London has missed you." Charlotte thanked her politely. The conversation began harmlessly. Weather. Charitable projects. Recent travels. Then, gradually, the tone shifted. "Your marriage remains the most discussed event of the year." Another lady smiled. Quite the romantic surprise. Charlotte sensed the trap immediately. "I am afraid life rarely consults us regarding timing." A few ladies laughed softly. Lady Pennington tilted her head. Still, one cannot help wondering whether everything worked out for the best. Charlotte remained calm. I believe it did. How fortunate. Another woman exchanged a glance with her companion. Not everyone receives such opportunities after disappointment. There it was. The real subject finally revealed. Charlotte kept her smile in place. Years of practice made it easier than most people realized. Fortune can be unpredictable. Indeed. Lady Pennington lowered her voice slightly. Though some people might say marrying a duke immediately afterward appears remarkably fortunate. Several women smiled behind their fans. The implication was obvious. Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks. Not because the comment wounded her. Because it reduced her marriage to social calculation. It reduced Alexander's character to a title. Before she could respond, another voice entered the conversation. Calm. Deep. Unmistakable. Some people would be mistaken. Silence fell instantly. Charlotte turned. Alexander stood several feet away. She had no idea how long he had been there. Judging by the expressions around her, long enough. Lady Pennington's smile faltered. Your Grace. Alexander inclined his head politely. His expression remained composed. Yet something dangerous existed beneath the calm surface. Not anger. Authority. I apologize for interrupting. His gaze moved briefly across the group. I could not help overhearing. No one spoke. Alexander continued. My wife was not fortunate because she married a duke. Charlotte's breath caught. Every woman present watched him carefully now. I was fortunate because she agreed to marry me. The words landed with astonishing force. Lady Pennington blinked. Another lady nearly dropped her fan. Charlotte simply stared. Alexander remained perfectly calm. As though he had merely commented on the weather. Yet the statement transformed everything. He had not defended himself. He had defended her. More than that. He had publicly assigned value to her independent of his title. In Victorian society, such distinctions mattered enormously. Alexander looked toward Charlotte. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. Would you care to dance? For several seconds, she could not find her voice. Finally she nodded. I would. He offered his hand. Charlotte accepted it. As they crossed toward the ballroom floor, whispers immediately erupted behind them. Alexander appeared completely unconcerned. The orchestra began a waltz. He guided her into position with practiced ease. Around them, dozens of couples moved across polished marble. Charlotte struggled to focus. His words continued echoing inside her mind. I was fortunate because she agreed to marry me. You did not have to do that. Alexander looked down at her. Do what? Rescue me. A faint smile appeared. I do not recall any rescue occurring. Charlotte laughed softly. You are impossible. I have been informed of that before. They danced in comfortable silence for several moments. Then Alexander spoke again. You should not have been placed in that position. Charlotte looked up. It was only gossip. No. His expression remained calm. It was disrespect. The simple certainty behind the statement affected her more than she expected. Most people dismissed such moments. Alexander did not. He treated small wounds as worthy of notice. Worthy of protection. Worthy of response. The realization settled quietly inside her heart. By the time the dance ended, something had changed. Not dramatically. Not visibly. Yet unmistakably. Trust had deepened. Across the ballroom, Victoria Fairmorn watched everything. Her jaw tightened. Ethan noticed immediately. What is wrong? Victoria forced a smile. Nothing. Yet her eyes remained fixed upon Charlotte and Alexander. Ethan followed her gaze. They seem happy. The comment only made Victoria more irritated. She looked away quickly. Appearances can be deceiving. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Victoria did not answer. Because the truth was difficult to explain. She had expected Charlotte to disappear quietly after the broken engagement. She had expected sympathy to fade and embarrassment to linger. Instead, Charlotte had become a duchess. Worse, she had become a duchess whose husband clearly valued her. Victoria disliked many things. Being wrong ranked among the worst. Later that night, after returning to Ravenshire House, Charlotte stood alone near a second-floor window overlooking the city. Moonlight reflected across rooftops and cobblestone streets. The ballroom felt very far away now. Yet Alexander's words remained vivid. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She turned as Alexander entered the room. "I thought you might still be awake." Charlotte smiled. "Apparently so." Silence settled comfortably between them. Then she spoke. "Thank you." Alexander understood immediately. "You do not need to thank me." "Perhaps not." Charlotte looked out the window again. "But I wanted to." Alexander joined her near the glass. For several moments neither spoke. The city stretched endlessly before them. Finally Charlotte glanced toward him. "You always know when someone is trying to hurt another person." Alexander's expression changed. Something distant flickered briefly in his eyes. Gone almost instantly. "Not always." The answer carried more weight than she understood. Before Charlotte could question it, another knock sounded at the door. Nathaniel Pierce entered carrying several papers. The secretary looked unusually serious. "Forgive the interruption." He handed a document to Alexander. Charlotte watched as her husband's expression hardened. Not dramatically. Just enough. "What is it?" she asked. Alexander looked toward her. Then toward Nathaniel. A silent exchange passed between them. Finally he folded the paper. "New information." Charlotte's pulse quickened. "About Ethan?" Alexander did not answer immediately. "About several people." The room suddenly felt colder. Somewhere beyond the windows, London continued sleeping peacefully. Yet Charlotte had the unmistakable feeling that the mystery surrounding her past was moving closer. And whatever truth Alexander had just discovered, it was important enough to erase every trace of warmth from his face. The moment Charlotte saw the letter, she knew it had not been meant for her. It was a small realization. An ordinary one. Yet it would occupy her thoughts for weeks afterward. 3 days had passed since the harvest celebration in London. 3 days since Nathaniel Pierce had arrived with troubling news and transformed the atmosphere inside Ravenshire House. Alexander had revealed very little. Only that the investigation continued and that certain financial records required further examination. Since then, he had become more distracted. Not distant. Never cold. Simply preoccupied. Charlotte noticed because she had begun paying attention to things she once overlooked. A thoughtful pause during breakfast. A longer silence while reviewing correspondence. The occasional faraway expression when he believed no one was watching. Something weighed upon him. He simply refused to share it. On a grey afternoon filled with steady autumn rain, Charlotte sought refuge in the library. The room had quickly become one of her favourite spaces in the London townhouse. A fire crackled inside the hearth. Shelves overflowed with books collected over generations. The scent of leather bindings and polished wood created a comforting familiarity. Charlotte spent nearly an hour browsing titles before selecting a volume of poetry. As she settled into a chair near the window, a folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages and landed softly upon the carpet. Charlotte blinked. She bent to retrieve it. At first she assumed it was a forgotten bookmark. Then she noticed the handwriting. The ink had faded slightly with age. The paper itself appeared several years old. Curiosity stirred immediately. She unfolded the letter. The first line captured her attention at once. "I saw her again today." Charlotte frowned. The sentence felt strangely personal. She continued reading. She was standing near the Western Garden during the charity event. Everyone else seemed occupied with appearances. She was occupied with people. I am beginning to suspect that kindness comes as naturally to her as breathing. Charlotte sat very still. The handwriting was unmistakably masculine. Elegant. Controlled. Familiar somehow. Yet she could not immediately place it. She continued reading. It is becoming increasingly difficult to pretend indifference. Not because anyone notices. No one does. That is part of the problem. No one seems to see her properly. The word sent an unexpected chill through her. Charlotte lowered the page briefly. The letter was clearly unfinished. Several paragraphs followed before the writing abruptly stopped. There was no signature at the bottom. No recipient identified. Nothing explaining why the document existed. Only a single set of initials written near the corner. A.W. Charlotte stared. A.W. Her pulse quickened. Alexander Ravenshire. She immediately shook her head. That was impossible. The conclusion arrived too quickly. Too conveniently. Hundreds of people shared those initials. Yet even as she argued against the possibility, a strange feeling settled inside her chest. She looked at the letter again. I am beginning to suspect that kindness comes as naturally to her as breathing. Charlotte read the line twice. Then a third time. Something about it felt deeply sincere. Almost intimate. Yet the woman being described remained unnamed. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it back inside the book. The entire discovery should have meant nothing. Instead, it followed her through the rest of the afternoon. That evening during dinner, Charlotte found herself studying Alexander more closely than usual. Candlelight danced across the dining room. The meal progressed quietly. Alexander appeared tired. Not physically. Mentally. His attention drifted several times before returning to the conversation. Charlotte waited until dessert before speaking. May I ask you something unusual? Alexander looked amused. That depends entirely upon the question. Charlotte hesitated. Have you ever written letters you never intended to send? For the first time all evening, Alexander appeared genuinely surprised. The reaction lasted only a second. Yet it existed. Charlotte saw it clearly. An oddly specific topic. Is that a yes? Alexander considered. Everyone writes things they later choose not to share. The answer felt careful. Too careful. Charlotte lowered her gaze toward her teacup. I suppose that is true. Alexander watched her for a moment. Why do you ask? Charlotte immediately regretted the conversation. Mentioning the letter felt intrusive. No particular reason. Alexander nodded slowly. Yet she sensed he did not entirely believe her. The subject changed. Neither returned to it. Later that night, Alexander remained in his study long after midnight. Several documents covered the desk. Financial records. Correspondence copies. Banking reports gathered through weeks of investigation. Nathaniel Pierce stood nearby reviewing additional paperwork. The pattern is becoming clearer. Nathaniel placed another file atop the growing stack. Every transaction leads back to the same group of investors. Alexander leaned back in his chair. And Lord Holloway. Connected to nearly all of them. Nathaniel hesitated. There is something else. Alexander looked up. Nathaniel handed him a folded document. A witness statement. Alexander opened it. As he read, his expression gradually darkened. Where did this come from? One of Fairmont's former business associates. Nathaniel crossed toward the fireplace. He claims Ethan's financial situation was considerably worse than anyone realized. Alexander already suspected as much. The statement merely confirmed it. Yet another detail caught his attention. The engagement. Nathaniel nodded. According to him, discussions regarding Miss Holloway began months before the public announcement. Silence settled over the room. Alexander slowly lowered the page. Months before. The timeline matched his fears exactly. Charlotte had been deceived long before anyone acknowledged it. The realization irritated him more than it should have. Nathaniel noticed immediately. You care about this more than an investigation. Alexander did not answer. The secretary sighed softly. One day you will have to admit it. Admit what? Nathaniel almost smiled. That none of this was ever truly about Fairmorn. Alexander returned his attention to the documents. The conversation ended there. Yet Nathaniel's words lingered. Because they contained more truth than Alexander wished to examine. The following afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Dowager Duchess Eleanor Ravenshire arrived unannounced. Charlotte greeted her warmly. Over the past months, the older woman had become something between family and friend. They spent several hours together discussing estate projects, charitable efforts, and recent social events. Eventually the conversation drifted elsewhere. You seem thoughtful. Eleanor studied Charlotte carefully. Charlotte smiled. Is it that obvious? Only to people paying attention. Eleanor accepted another cup of tea. What troubles you? Charlotte considered offering a polite answer. Instead, she found herself speaking honestly. Have you ever realized there are things everyone else understands except you? Eleanor laughed softly. Constantly. I am serious. So am I. The older woman set down her teacup. Life rarely provides complete explanations. Charlotte hesitated. What if someone is keeping secrets? Eleanor's expression changed slightly. Not alarm. Interest. That depends on the secret. Charlotte stared into the fire. What if the secret concerns you? Silence lingered. Eleanor studied her carefully now. Has Alexander done something to earn your distrust? The question surprised her. No. The answer arrived instantly. Absolutely instantly. Charlotte blinked. That realization mattered. She did not distrust him. She simply did not understand him. Eleanor seemed to notice. Then perhaps patience is wiser than suspicion. Charlotte looked up. You make that sound easy. Eleanor smiled knowingly. It rarely is. Several days later, Charlotte returned to the library. Not intentionally searching for the letter. At least that was what she told herself. The book remained exactly where she had left it. The folded page still rested between the same chapters. This time she read the entire thing more carefully. Certain phrases stood out immediately. She laughs differently when she forgets people are watching. She listens when others are ignored. She possesses more courage than she realizes. Charlotte's breath caught. Whoever wrote these words had observed the woman closely. Very closely. Yet the tone contained remarkable restraint. Admiration hidden beneath discipline. Affection concealed behind careful distance. Again she reached the bottom of the page. Again the initials waited. A.W. Before she could continue thinking about it, footsteps sounded behind her. Charlotte quickly closed the book. She turned. Alexander stood in the doorway. For one brief second neither spoke. Something unexpected passed between them. Awareness. Curiosity. Perhaps even uncertainty. Alexander's gaze moved toward the book resting in her lap. Am I interrupting? Charlotte's heart suddenly beat much faster than necessary. No. Alexander entered the room. You seem surprised to see me. Charlotte attempted a smile. Only slightly. His expression softened. I was looking for a particular volume. Charlotte glanced toward the shelves. You have thousands. An unfortunate consequence of collecting books for 20 years. She laughed. The tension eased slightly. Yet the letter remained hidden inside the book resting on her lap. The knowledge felt strangely significant. Alexander moved toward a nearby shelf. Charlotte watched him. The afternoon sunlight illuminated the side of his face. Calm. Composed. Familiar. Yet suddenly she found herself wondering something she had never considered before. Had Alexander always noticed her? The question appeared ridiculous. Impossible. And yet the letter lingered in her thoughts. She was still wondering when Alexander selected a book and turned back toward her. Neither of them realized that the answer to that question would eventually change everything. The first snowfall arrived earlier than expected. Thin white flakes drifted across London rooftops and settled lightly upon carriage tops, iron gates, and bare tree branches. From the windows of Ravenshire House, the city appeared softened. Almost peaceful. Charlotte stood near the glass watching the snow accumulate along Grosvenor Square while a maid adjusted the final ribbon on her evening gown. "You look beautiful, Your Grace." Charlotte smiled politely. "You are very kind." The maid beamed. "It is true." Charlotte glanced at her reflection. The deep sapphire silk suited the season. Diamonds borrowed from the Ravenshire collection sparkled softly against her throat. Everything appeared perfect. Yet unease lingered beneath the surface. Tonight marked the winter assembly at Blackwood Hall, one of the largest social events before Christmas. Half of London's aristocracy would attend, which meant Ethan and Victoria would almost certainly be present. Charlotte had not mentioned the concern aloud. She did not need to. Alexander seemed to sense these things without explanation. When she descended the staircase 20 minutes later, he was already waiting in the entrance hall. Dressed in black evening attire, he looked every bit the powerful Duke society believed him to be. Yet Charlotte had long since learned that the man beneath the reputation mattered far more. Alexander looked up as she approached. For a brief moment his expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough to make her pause. "You look lovely." The compliment was simple. Sincere. Somehow that made it more effective. Charlotte felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "Thank you." Alexander offered his arm. "Ready?" Charlotte glanced toward the front door. Snow continued falling outside. "Perhaps." A faint smile appeared. An encouraging level of enthusiasm. The carriage ride passed comfortably. They discussed estate matters, charitable projects, and a recent letter from Eleanor Ravenshire. Nothing serious. Nothing complicated. Yet Charlotte remained aware of something she had noticed more frequently in recent months. Silence with Alexander never felt uncomfortable. They did not need constant conversation. The realization brought an unexpected sense of peace. Blackwood Hall blazed with light when they arrived. Hundreds of lanterns illuminated the exterior. Footmen guided arriving guests through the falling snow. Music drifted faintly through the open entrance as carriages lined the circular drive. Inside, the ballroom glittered beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. The room seemed larger than Charlotte remembered. Elegant gowns moved like waves of color across polished marble floors. Laughter echoed through the air. Society at its most polished. Most competitive. Most observant. The moment Alexander and Charlotte entered, attention shifted toward them. It always did. Charlotte no longer found the scrutiny quite as intimidating. Not when Alexander stood beside her. Still, she felt dozens of eyes following their progress through the room. "You are becoming accustomed to this." Alexander spoke quietly as they greeted several acquaintances. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. To being observed. To surviving it. She considered that. Perhaps. Alexander nodded slightly. Good. Before she could ask what he meant, a familiar voice interrupted. "Your Grace." Charlotte turned. Her stomach tightened immediately. Victoria Fairmorn stood before her. Elegant as ever. Perfectly dressed. Perfectly composed. Ethan remained nearby. Charlotte noticed something immediately. Neither appeared especially happy. The observation surprised her. Victoria smiled. "How lovely to see you." Charlotte returned the greeting politely. Years of aristocratic training carried her through the awkwardness. Ethan offered a respectful nod toward Alexander. The Duke acknowledged it with cool courtesy. The exchange remained entirely proper. Entirely civil. Yet tension existed beneath every word. Charlotte felt it. Apparently so did Victoria. "London has been talking about your charitable work." Victoria's smile remained fixed. You seem to have adapted wonderfully to married life. Charlotte recognized the compliment for what it was. An attempt to evaluate. To measure. To determine whether she was truly content. I have been very fortunate. Victoria's eyes flickered briefly toward Alexander. Something unpleasant passed through her expression. Gone almost immediately. Yet Charlotte saw it. So did Alexander. The conversation ended moments later. Everyone departed with perfect manners. Yet as Charlotte watched Victoria disappear into the crowd, an uneasy feeling settled inside her chest. Something is wrong. Alexander's voice came quietly beside her. Charlotte looked up. You noticed? Yes. She glanced across the ballroom. I cannot explain it. Alexander followed her gaze. His expression darkened slightly. Perhaps we are not the only people keeping secrets. The remark lingered in her thoughts long afterward. An hour later, the evening took a sharp turn. Charlotte had just finished speaking with several ladies regarding a literacy initiative when laughter erupted nearby. At first she paid little attention. Ballrooms were full of laughter. Then she heard her own name. Instinctively, she looked toward the source. A group of guests stood gathered near one of the refreshment tables. Most appeared uncomfortable. A few appeared entertained. In the center stood Lady Pennington. Charlotte recognized her immediately. Unfortunately, the older woman possessed an unfortunate talent for disguising cruelty as conversation. I simply find the situation remarkable. Lady Pennington's voice carried farther than she likely intended. One season a gentleman abandons you. The next season you become a duchess. Several people exchanged uneasy glances. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken. Not because the comment was particularly original. Because it was public. Deliberately public. Lady Pennington continued. Life rewards some people in extraordinary ways. A few guests laughed nervously. Others looked away. Charlotte understood exactly what was happening. This was not gossip. This was humiliation disguised as wit. The old wound being displayed once again for entertainment. For one painful moment, she found herself standing exactly where she had stood months ago. Observed. Judged. Forced to endure another person's version of her story. Silence settled across the immediate area. Everyone waited. Everyone watched. Charlotte drew a slow breath. She opened her mouth to respond. Another voice reached the crowd first. You are correct, Lady Pennington. The ballroom seemed to freeze. Alexander stepped forward from across the room. Calm. Controlled. Entirely composed. Yet something about him commanded immediate attention. Lady Pennington blinked. Your Grace? Alexander stopped beside Charlotte. His presence alone altered the atmosphere. Life did reward someone extraordinarily. He looked directly at Charlotte. Not the crowd. Not Lady Pennington. Charlotte. It rewarded me. Silence. Complete silence. The orchestra continued playing somewhere in the distance. Yet the guests nearest them might as well have stopped breathing. Alexander turned his attention toward Lady Pennington. His expression remained polite. That somehow made the moment more devastating. My wife's character, intelligence, and generosity would be remarkable regardless of whom she married. No one spoke. No one moved. Reducing her value to circumstances beyond her control reflects poorly upon the speaker. Not upon her. The words landed with quiet precision. Not cruel. Not angry. Simply undeniable. Lady Pennington's face turned bright red. Around her, several guests suddenly found other places to look. Charlotte stared at Alexander. Her heart was beating so hard she could barely hear anything else. Because once again, he had done something no one had ever done before. He had chosen her publicly. Not out of obligation. Not out of courtesy. Deliberately. Unapologetically. Before everyone. Alexander offered his arm. Would you care to step outside for a moment? Charlotte nodded. Speaking felt impossible. They left the ballroom together. Cool winter air greeted them as they stepped onto the terrace overlooking the snow-covered gardens. The sudden quiet felt almost surreal after the intensity inside. Charlotte gripped the stone railing. Her emotions felt tangled. Gratitude. Embarrassment. Relief. Something deeper she was not yet prepared to name. Alexander remained beside her. Neither spoke immediately. Snow drifted softly through the darkness. Finally Charlotte laughed. The sound surprised even her. I believe Lady Pennington dislikes me. Alexander looked genuinely thoughtful. I suspect that may be true. Charlotte laughed harder. This time Alexander smiled as well. The tension eased. Yet the memory remained. After several moments, Charlotte turned toward him. You did not have to say any of that. Alexander's gaze met hers. Steady. Unwavering. Yes, I did. The answer stunned her. Why? He looked away briefly toward the falling snow. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. More personal. Because I am tired of watching people misunderstand you. Charlotte froze. The word struck with unexpected force. Watching. The same word echoed through her mind. Watching. Suddenly she remembered the unfinished letter hidden inside the library book. I saw her again today. She possesses more courage than she realizes. A.W. Her breath caught. Alexander seemed unaware of the connection unfolding inside her mind. He continued staring toward the gardens. Charlotte studied his profile illuminated by lantern light and drifting snow. For the first time, a possibility she had dismissed as impossible no longer felt impossible at all. Before she could say anything, the terrace door opened behind them. Nathaniel Pierce appeared. His usually calm expression looked unusually urgent. Your Grace. Alexander immediately recognized the seriousness in his tone. What happened? Nathaniel stepped closer. The witness from Manchester arrived. Charlotte watched Alexander's expression change. Instantly. Completely. Whatever warmth had existed moments earlier vanished beneath concentration. And? Nathaniel lowered his voice. He confirmed everything. The word settled heavily in the cold night air. Charlotte felt a chill unrelated to the weather. Alexander did not move for several seconds. Then he looked toward the ballroom windows where hundreds of guests continued celebrating, entirely unaware that somewhere beneath the glittering surface of society, a carefully hidden truth had just begun to unravel. The journey back from Blackwood Hall took place in near silence. Snow continued falling beyond the carriage windows. Lantern light flickered across the passing streets of London. Yet Charlotte barely noticed any of it. Nathaniel's words continued echoing inside her mind. He confirmed everything. The statement felt significant. Important. Final. Alexander sat opposite her, his expression thoughtful and distant. Not withdrawn from her. Focused elsewhere. On facts. On evidence. On whatever truth had just emerged from months of investigation. Charlotte considered asking questions. Several times, she nearly did. Yet something stopped her. Perhaps instinct. Perhaps trust. Whatever the reason, she remained silent. When they finally arrived at Ravenshire House, Alexander turned toward her before stepping from the carriage. I am sorry the evening ended this way. Charlotte blinked. This way. A faint crease appeared between his brows. With more questions than answers. The response surprised her. More than that, it softened something inside her chest. Because even now, with his attention divided between investigations and responsibilities, he still understood her. I am becoming accustomed to unanswered questions. Alexander's expression changed slightly. Regret flickered there. Brief but unmistakable. You should not have to. Before she could respond, he offered his hand to help her from the carriage. The conversation ended. Yet the words remained. The following morning, Ravenshire House woke to an atmosphere of quiet tension. Charlotte sensed it immediately. Servants moved normally. Breakfast arrived on time. Correspondence appeared beside every place setting. Yet beneath the ordinary routine, something had shifted. Alexander spent most of the morning inside his study with Nathaniel. Several visitors arrived and departed. Documents moved between rooms. Messages were sent. More messages returned. By afternoon, Charlotte found herself standing beside a library window once again. Snow blanketed the square outside. A book rested open in her hands. She had not turned a page in nearly 20 minutes. Her thoughts remained elsewhere. The letter. The investigation. The witness from Manchester. And most of all, the increasingly impossible question she could no longer ignore. Had Alexander cared about her long before their marriage? The possibility felt absurd. Yet every new piece of information pushed her closer to believing it. A knock sounded softly at the library door. Charlotte looked up. Eleanor Ravenshire entered carrying a small stack of correspondence. "There you are." Charlotte smiled. "You always seem to know where to find me." Eleanor glanced around the room. "You are either here or in the gardens." She settled into a nearby chair. "It simplifies matters." Charlotte laughed softly. Yet Eleanor's sharp eyes immediately noticed something beneath the smile. "You are thinking again. That is becoming a criticism. Only because you do it so intensely." Charlotte looked down at the book in her lap. "May I ask you something?" Eleanor's expression became thoughtful. "That depends entirely upon the question." Charlotte hesitated. "Did Alexander ever speak about me before our marriage?" Silence followed. Not long. Just long enough. Eleanor set the letters aside. "That is an interesting question." Charlotte immediately noticed what the older woman had not said. She had not said no. "It is also a very specific question," Eleanor added. Charlotte looked away. "Perhaps." Eleanor studied her for several seconds. Then something almost affectionate appeared in her expression. "My dear." Her voice softened. "There are some stories that belong to the people living them." Charlotte's pulse quickened. "That is not an answer." "No." Eleanor smiled faintly. "It is not." The conversation moved elsewhere after that. Yet Charlotte barely heard any of it. Because Eleanor's response had revealed more than a direct answer ever could. Meanwhile, several blocks away, another conversation was unfolding. Victoria Fairmorn stood inside an elegant sitting room overlooking Hyde Park. Winter sunlight filtered through the curtains. Tea sat untouched upon a nearby table. Ethan paced across the carpet. "You are avoiding the question." Victoria kept her gaze fixed upon the window. "Because it is a foolish question." Ethan stopped walking. "Then answer it." Victoria closed her eyes briefly. The argument had repeated itself for nearly a week. Ever since Blackwood Hall. Ever since he had begun noticing things she wished he would ignore. "Why are you so interested in Charlotte?" Ethan demanded. Victoria turned sharply. "I am not interested in Charlotte." "Then why do you watch her every time she enters a room?" The accusation hung heavily between them. Victoria felt irritation surge immediately. Not because Ethan was wrong. Because he was closer to the truth than she liked. "This conversation is absurd." Ethan laughed without humor. "Is it?" Victoria rose from her chair. "You are imagining problems where none exist." Ethan stared at her. Then something changed in his expression. Understanding. Not complete understanding. Just enough. "You hate that she is happy." Victoria froze. Silence filled the room. Ethan slowly shook his head. "Good Lord." Victoria's composure cracked. "Only slightly. Yet enough. You do not understand anything." Ethan looked away. For the first time in months, uncertainty appeared in his face. Because suddenly he was questioning things he had never questioned before. Why had Victoria pushed so aggressively toward marriage? Why had she seemed obsessed with defeating Charlotte long after the engagement ended? Why did every mention of Ravenshire provoke irritation? Questions multiplied rapidly. Unfortunately for Victoria, she no longer controlled all the answers. 2 days later, those questions became far more dangerous. Alexander sat across from a gentleman named Robert Hensley inside a private office near London's financial district. Hensley was the witness from Manchester, a former associate connected to several business ventures involving Ethan Fairmorn and Lord Holloway's investment network. The meeting had lasted nearly an hour. Every answer strengthened Alexander's suspicions. "You are absolutely certain?" Alexander asked quietly. Hensley nodded. "I would stake my reputation on it." Alexander folded his hands. "Tell me again." Hensley sighed. Fairmorn was nearly ruined. The words hung heavily in the room. Much deeper in debt than anyone realized. Alexander remained silent. Hensley continued. Then suddenly everything changed. After meeting Miss Holloway. After meeting her father. Hensley leaned forward. The investments. The introductions. The financial support. It all appeared at exactly the right moment. Alexander exchanged a glance with Nathaniel. Neither spoke. Hensley lowered his voice. "People assumed it was luck. And you disagree?" "Completely." Alexander waited. Hensley hesitated before delivering the final piece. "I believe the marriage was negotiated long before the engagement ended." Silence settled across the office. Nathaniel slowly exhaled. Alexander's expression remained unchanged. Yet inwardly, everything sharpened. Because this was no longer suspicion. This was evidence. Not enough evidence for public accusation. Not yet. But enough to establish a pattern. A very troubling pattern. When the meeting ended, Alexander and Nathaniel stepped into the cold afternoon air. Snow crunched beneath their boots. The city bustled around them. Unaware. Indifferent. Nathaniel broke the silence first. "What now?" Alexander looked toward the crowded street. "Now we find proof." "And when we do?" Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. "Then the truth belongs to Charlotte." That evening, Charlotte sat alone in the library once more. The unfinished letter rested beside her. She had promised herself not to read it again. She had failed spectacularly. The paper felt familiar now. Dangerous in its own way. Because every time she read it, the same impossible thought returned. She was studying one particular sentence when footsteps approached. She quickly folded the page. Alexander appeared moments later. "There you are." Charlotte smiled. "Apparently." He crossed toward the fireplace. For several moments neither spoke. Then Alexander held out a folded document. "I think you should read this." Charlotte immediately sensed the significance. She accepted the paper carefully. The document contained a summary. Financial timelines. Dates. Investment records. Names. She recognized several immediately. Ethan. Victoria. Lord Holloway. As she continued reading, her expression slowly changed. Confusion became disbelief. Disbelief became understanding. Not complete understanding. But enough. This cannot be right. Alexander's voice remained calm. "I am afraid it is." Charlotte looked up. "You believe Ethan was planning to leave long before he actually did?" "Yes." Her stomach tightened. "And Victoria knew?" Alexander hesitated. "We believe so." Charlotte stared at the page. Every memory suddenly felt different. Every conversation. Every promise. Every excuse Ethan had offered during those final months. Had all of it been false? The realization hurt more than she expected. Not because she still loved him. Because she had once trusted him. Alexander seemed to understand immediately. He moved closer but did not touch her. Giving her space. Giving her dignity. As always. "Charlotte." She looked up. His expression softened. None of this reflects your worth. The words reached deeper than he realized. Charlotte lowered her gaze. Then she noticed something. Near the bottom of the document. A date. Her breath caught. Alexander. His eyes met hers. Charlotte pointed toward the page. This investigation began before you proposed. Silence. Complete silence. For the first time since she had known him, Alexander appeared caught off guard. Not dramatically. Just enough. Yet it was there. Charlotte saw it clearly. Her pulse quickened. Because suddenly the investigation, the letter, the unanswered questions, and the impossible suspicions all seemed connected. And for the first time, she sensed she was standing at the edge of a truth far more personal than either of them had planned to reveal. For several seconds after Charlotte's question, neither of them moved. The library seemed unusually quiet. Even the fire crackling inside the hearth felt distant. Alexander looked at the document in her hands. Then at her face. Charlotte had never seen him hesitate quite like this before. Not because he lacked confidence. Because he was choosing his words carefully. Yes. The answer came at last. Simple. Honest. Charlotte's pulse quickened. You began investigating before you proposed. Alexander nodded once. I did. Charlotte searched his expression. Why? 1,000 possible explanations flashed through her mind. None of them felt sufficient. Alexander looked toward the fire briefly before meeting her gaze again. At first, because something about the situation felt wrong. Charlotte remained silent. He continued. The timing. The financial records. The sudden engagement. None of it made sense. So you investigated? Yes. Charlotte lowered her eyes toward the papers. The explanation sounded logical. Reasonable. Yet something still felt incomplete. She could sense it. Only because it felt wrong, she asked quietly. Another pause followed. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not entirely. Charlotte's heart skipped. There it was. The missing piece. The truth hiding between the words. Before either of them could continue, a knock interrupted the moment. Nathaniel entered carrying several folders. He stopped immediately upon noticing the atmosphere. I apologize. Alexander straightened. The opportunity vanished. What is it? Nathaniel glanced briefly toward Charlotte before answering. Additional correspondence from Manchester. Alexander accepted the documents. Charlotte knew enough to recognize dismissal when she saw it. Not intentional. Not cruel. Merely unavoidable. The investigation had returned. The conversation ended unfinished. Yet for the first time, Charlotte believed she was getting closer to understanding the man she had married. 2 weeks later, London prepared for one of the final major social gatherings before Christmas. The Ashcombe Winter Ball was famous for its guest list, elaborate decorations, and endless opportunities for gossip. Charlotte would have preferred remaining in Hampshire. Unfortunately, certain invitations could not be declined. The evening arrived cold and clear. Snow still lingered along the streets. Lanterns reflected against frozen cobblestones as carriages crowded the roads leading toward Ashcombe House. Charlotte stood before a mirror fastening a sapphire bracelet when Alexander entered her dressing room. His gaze found her reflection immediately. You look beautiful. Charlotte smiled. You have become very consistent. Only because it remains true. The warmth in his voice lingered long after the words ended. Over recent months, moments like these had become more common. Small. Quiet. Meaningful. The kind of moments that slip beneath defenses before one realized they were there. Charlotte turned toward him. Are you prepared for an evening of endless conversation? Alexander sighed dramatically. I am a duke. I am never prepared for endless conversation. Charlotte laughed. The sound seemed to please him more than it should have. Less than an hour later they arrived at Ashcombe House. The ballroom glittered beneath hundreds of candles. Evergreen garlands decorated the walls. Music filled the air. The event was magnificent. It was also exhausting. Within minutes, Charlotte found herself engaged in a series of polite conversations. Ladies discussed holiday plans. Gentlemen discussed politics. Everyone discussed everyone else. Such was London society. For a time, the evening proceeded smoothly. Then Charlotte noticed Victoria Fairmorn. The other woman stood near the center of the ballroom speaking with several influential guests. Elegant as always. Confident as always. Yet something seemed different tonight. Strained perhaps. As though maintaining composure required greater effort than usual. Charlotte might have ignored the observation entirely if Victoria had done the same. Unfortunately, she did not. Nearly an hour later, Charlotte stepped away from the ballroom toward a quieter gallery lined with paintings. She welcomed the brief escape. The room was nearly empty. For perhaps 30 seconds, she enjoyed complete peace. Then she heard approaching footsteps. Charlotte turned. Victoria stood in the doorway. Alone. Neither woman spoke immediately. The silence stretched. "You seem happy." Victoria finally broke it. Charlotte blinked. The comment was unexpected. "I am." Victoria's expression tightened. "That must be nice." Charlotte studied her carefully. There was bitterness in the words. Not hidden particularly well. Victoria. She chose her next words carefully. "Whatever happened in the past, I do not wish to continue fighting old battles." Victoria laughed softly. The sound held very little humor. "How generous." Charlotte frowned. "I mean it." "Of course you do." Victoria crossed her arms. "You have everything now." The statement landed harder than intended. Charlotte stared. "Everything?" Victoria looked away. "A title. Respect. A husband who looks at you as though you are the only person in the room." Charlotte felt her breath catch. For the first time, genuine emotion cracked Victoria's carefully maintained composure. Jealousy. Not of wealth. Not of status. Something deeper. Charlotte suddenly understood. Victoria had expected victory to bring satisfaction. It had not. "Victoria. Do not." Victoria shook her head. "Please." For one brief moment, she looked tired. Truly tired. Then the mask returned. The moment vanished. "Enjoy your evening, Your Grace." She turned and walked away. Charlotte remained standing alone in the gallery long after she disappeared. Because the conversation had raised more questions than answers. Again. The evening might have ended there. It did not. An hour later, events took a much more troubling turn. Charlotte had just returned to the ballroom when she noticed an unusual gathering near one side of the room. Conversations had softened. Guests exchanged glances. Something had happened. Her instinct sharpened immediately. Alexander appeared beside her. "Stay close." The tone of his voice caught her attention. "What is it?" Alexander's expression darkened. "I am not sure yet." Together they moved toward the disturbance. As they approached, Charlotte recognized several familiar faces. Ethan Fairmorn stood among them. So did Lord Holloway. Neither looked comfortable. The tension was obvious. Nathaniel appeared moments later. He leaned toward Alexander and spoke quietly. Charlotte caught only fragments. "Document. Witness. Confirmed." Alexander's face became unreadable. "Are you certain?" Nathaniel nodded. "Completely." Charlotte watched the exchange carefully. Her pulse accelerated. Something important was happening. Something connected to the investigation. Across the room, Ethan seemed increasingly agitated. He glanced repeatedly toward Lord Holloway. The older man avoided eye contact. Several nearby guests were beginning to notice. Rumors spread quickly in ballrooms. Faster than fire through dry grass. Charlotte sensed disaster approaching long before it arrived. Then Lady Pennington made everything worse. Once again, the woman approached a nearby group with the subtlety of a marching band. Her voice carried farther than intended. Or perhaps exactly as far as intended. One does wonder whether some marriages are truly built upon affection. Several guests turned. Ethan visibly stiffened. Victoria, standing nearby, looked alarmed. Lady Pennington continued. Financial necessity can be a powerful motivator. The implication landed instantly. Too instantly. Charlotte watched Ethan's face drain of color. Lord Holloway looked furious. Victoria looked terrified. Suddenly the room felt smaller. Quieter. Dangerous. Alexander took a step forward. His expression had changed completely now. Charlotte had seen him calm. Thoughtful. Protective. She had never seen this version of him. Controlled anger radiated beneath the surface. Not explosive. Worse. Precise. Enough. The single word cut through the room. Silence followed immediately. Lady Pennington stopped speaking. Several conversations died mid-sentence. Even the musicians seemed uncertain. Alexander's gaze moved across the gathering. Speculation serves no one. His voice remained calm. Yet nobody mistook it for a request. Charlotte felt a strange mixture of surprise and admiration. He rarely displayed authority this openly. When he did, people listened. Immediately, Lady Pennington lowered her eyes. For perhaps the first time in her life. Alexander turned toward Charlotte. The anger vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Would you like some air?" Charlotte nodded. Together they moved toward the terrace. The cold night greeted them instantly. Snow glittered beneath moonlight. For several moments neither spoke. Then Charlotte looked up at him. "You were angry." Alexander stared toward the gardens. "Perhaps. I do not think I have ever seen that before." A faint smile appeared. "I hope you do not see it often." Charlotte studied him carefully. "Was it because of me?" Alexander looked at her then. Really looked at her. The silence stretched between them. Honest. Vulnerable. Dangerous. Finally he answered. "Partly." Her heartbeat accelerated. The honesty startled her. Alexander rarely revealed emotion so directly. Before she could respond, the terrace door opened. Nathaniel stepped outside. His expression was grim. "Your Grace." Alexander immediately understood. What happened? Nathaniel handed him a folded paper. The final statement arrived. Alexander opened it. "Read." Then read again. Charlotte watched every subtle change in his expression. When he finally lowered the document, something fundamental had shifted. Not uncertainty. Certainty. Complete certainty. Nathaniel spoke quietly. "There is no doubt anymore." Alexander nodded once. Slowly. Deliberately. Then he looked toward the brightly lit ballroom visible through the windows. Toward Ethan. Toward Victoria. Toward the carefully constructed story society had believed for months. No. His voice was calm. Yet it carried extraordinary weight. "There is no doubt at all." Charlotte felt a chill travel through her. Because for the first time since the investigation began, she realized the truth was no longer hiding. It had been found. And whatever Alexander had just confirmed was powerful enough to change far more than a broken engagement. It was powerful enough to change lives. Charlotte did not sleep that night. Long after returning from Ashcombe House, she remained awake beside the bedroom window watching moonlight stretch across the snow-covered gardens of Ravenshire House. The city beyond had grown quiet. Carriages no longer rattled across the streets. The world seemed suspended in stillness. Yet her thoughts refused to rest. The truth had been found. She knew that much. She had seen it in Alexander's face. Whatever evidence had arrived that evening had ended the investigation. The uncertainty was gone. Only certainty remained. Unfortunately, certainty belonged to Alexander, not to her. The realization frustrated her more than she cared to admit. She trusted him entirely. Yet she was tired of standing at the edge of answers without reaching them. Beside the fireplace, Alexander sat reading through several documents. The same documents Nathaniel had delivered at the ball. The flames cast shifting shadows across his face. Charlotte watched him quietly. The longer she looked, the more impossible it became to ignore a simple truth. Somewhere along the way, she had fallen in love with her husband. The realization arrived with startling clarity. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Simply undeniable. It had happened gradually. During conversations beside fireplaces. During carriage rides through the countryside. During moments when he listened rather than spoke. During every quiet act of respect and protection. Charlotte lowered her eyes. The timing felt almost cruel. Because she still did not fully understand him. A few minutes later, Alexander closed the final document. The sound echoed softly through the room. Charlotte looked up. He was already watching her. Neither spoke immediately. Then Alexander stood. "We need to talk." The word settled heavily between them. Charlotte nodded. "I know." An hour later they sat alone in the private library. Every servant had retired for the evening. The fire burned low. Outside, snow continued falling softly against the windows. The room felt isolated from the rest of the world. Perhaps that was appropriate. Because what followed belonged only to them. Alexander remained standing near the fireplace for several moments before finally speaking. "The investigation is over." Charlotte folded her hands in her lap. "And?" Alexander looked directly at her. "Ethan Fairmorn was financially ruined before he ended your engagement." The statement hurt less than she expected. Perhaps because she already suspected it. Alexander continued. Several business ventures failed. He accumulated significant debt. Lord Holloway became aware of the situation. Charlotte listened carefully. And Victoria? She knew. The answer came quietly. Without hesitation. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Not because the truth surprised her. Because hearing it confirmed something painful. The marriage was arranged. Alexander nodded. Not formally. But effectively, yes. Charlotte stared into the fire. Every memory from that period suddenly shifted. Every excuse. Every delay. Every promise. None of it had been real. Ethan had not chosen love. He had chosen rescue. How long, she asked. Months before the engagement ended. Silence followed. Charlotte breathed slowly. The information should have devastated her. Instead, she felt strangely detached. As though she were listening to the story of another woman. Perhaps because she no longer loved Ethan. Perhaps because the life she had now mattered more than the life she once imagined. Alexander seemed to sense the shift. "Are you all right?" Charlotte looked up. "I think so." The concern in his expression softened. Yet neither of them moved beyond the moment. Not yet. Because another question still waited between them. Charlotte finally spoke it. "Why did you begin investigating?" Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. There it was. The real conversation. The one they had avoided for months. "I told you part of the answer already." "Only part." Alexander exhaled slowly. Then he crossed the room and sat opposite her. For the first time since she had known him, he looked genuinely uncertain. The sight alone made her heart ache. "You deserve the entire truth." Charlotte's pulse quickened. Alexander looked toward the fire before beginning. "For years ago, I attended a charity event in London." Charlotte frowned slightly. The details seemed unrelated. "I remember the event." Alexander nodded. "So do I." Silence lingered. Then he smiled faintly. Not with amusement. With memory. You argued with 3 committee members. Charlotte blinked. What? They wanted to reduce funding for several schools. The smile deepened slightly. You informed them they were short-sighted. Charlotte stared. You were there. Yes. The room suddenly felt smaller. I never saw you. No. His voice remained gentle. You did not. Charlotte's heart began beating faster. Alexander continued. After that, I noticed you occasionally at social events. The word sounded carefully chosen. Controlled. Yet emotion lingered beneath them. You always seemed more interested in helping people than impressing them. Charlotte remained completely still. Alexander looked down briefly. Then back at her. I admired that. The fire crackled softly between them. Charlotte barely heard it. Because the impossible possibility she had been trying to ignore was no longer impossible. Alexander continued. Years passed. His gaze held hers. Then you became engaged. Charlotte's throat tightened. To Ethan. Yes. A shadow crossed his expression. Gone almost immediately. I respected your decision. Charlotte suddenly remembered the unfinished letter hidden inside the library book. The initials. The observations. The admiration concealed beneath restraint. Her pulse accelerated. The letter. Alexander froze. Completely. The reaction answered everything. Charlotte's breath caught. I found it months ago. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Alexander laughed softly. A sound filled with resignation. Of course you did. Charlotte stared. You wrote it. It was not a question anymore. Alexander nodded once. Yes. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Every mystery suddenly aligned. Every unanswered question. Every careful glance. Every impossible coincidence. Charlotte could barely breathe. The woman in the letter was me. Alexander's voice was almost inaudible. Yes. Emotion rushed through her chest so suddenly she could not immediately name it. Shock. Wonder. Gratitude. Heartbreak. Love. All tangled together. How long, she whispered. Alexander looked at her. Truly looked at her. The walls he maintained so carefully finally gone. Longer than I should admit. Charlotte felt tears gathering despite her efforts. Not tears of sadness. Something far more dangerous. You loved me before Ethan left. Silence. Then the answer. Honest. Unprotected. Absolute. Yes. The word shattered every remaining doubt. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. The weight of it settled over her. Years. He had carried this for years. Without expectation. Without demand. Without even telling her. Alexander continued quietly. When the engagement ended, I told myself the investigation was about fairness. A faint smile touched his lips. Nathaniel saw through that immediately. Charlotte laughed through tears. Somehow the image felt entirely believable. Alexander's expression softened. The truth is that I could not stand the idea of someone hurting you and walking away without consequence. The confession struck deeper than any declaration of love could have. Because it explained everything. The investigation. The protection. The patience. The impossible kindness. Charlotte looked at him through tears she no longer bothered hiding. Why didn't you tell me? Alexander's answer came immediately. Because I never wanted you to feel obligated. The simplicity of it broke her heart. Not because it hurt. Because it revealed exactly who he was. A man who would rather suffer quietly than risk taking advantage of someone else's pain. Charlotte rose from her chair. Alexander did the same. For a moment neither moved. The distance between them suddenly felt enormous. Then Charlotte crossed it. Not dramatically. Simply. Naturally. She reached for his hand. Alexander looked down in visible surprise. Charlotte smiled through her tears. "You are an extraordinary man." Emotion flickered across his face. Raw. Unhidden. Perhaps for the first time. "Charlotte." She squeezed his hand gently. "And you are an absolute fool for waiting so long." A startled laugh escaped him. The sound warmed the entire room. For several seconds neither looked away. Outside, snow continued falling across London. Inside, something long hidden had finally stepped into the light. And for the first time since their story began, there were no more secrets between them. 3 days after the conversation in the library, Charlotte felt as though the entire world had quietly shifted. Nothing around her appeared different. Ravenshire House remained elegant. London remained busy. Snow still covered rooftops and garden walls. Yet everything inside her had changed. For months she had wondered whether her marriage rested upon duty, respect, and circumstance. Now she knew the truth. Love had been there from the beginning. Patient. Silent. Waiting. The knowledge followed her everywhere. It colored every glance Alexander gave her. Every thoughtful gesture. Every moment she remembered from the past year. Things she once considered ordinary suddenly carried new meaning. The way he always noticed when she was uncomfortable. The way he listened. The way he stepped between her and criticism without hesitation. None of it had been accidental. One cold afternoon, Charlotte stood beside the window of Alexander's study while snow drifted across the gardens beyond. Alexander sat at his desk reviewing correspondence. Nathaniel occupied a chair nearby, sorting documents into careful stacks. The atmosphere remained professional until Nathaniel cleared his throat. "The invitations have arrived." Alexander looked up. "For the Beaumont Winter Gala?" "Yes." Nathaniel handed over a cream-colored envelope. Charlotte immediately recognized the event. The Beaumont Gala was one of the most prestigious gatherings of the season. Hundreds of guests would attend. Aristocrats. Politicians. Businessmen. Nearly everyone connected to London society. Alexander opened the invitation and read silently. Nathaniel waited. Charlotte noticed something unusual. Both men appeared thoughtful. "There is another matter," Nathaniel finally said. Alexander already knew what was coming. "The Fairmorn situation." Nathaniel nodded. Charlotte turned toward them fully. Months ago, such conversations would have ended the moment she entered a room. Now Alexander simply looked at her. "You should hear this." Nathaniel placed several documents upon the desk. "Additional witnesses have come forward." Charlotte crossed the room slowly. Alexander stood and offered her the chair beside him. She Saturday. Nathaniel continued. "The financial arrangement between Ethan Fairmorn and Lord Holloway is no longer speculation." He tapped one of the documents. "It is documented." Charlotte read several lines. Then several more. The evidence was overwhelming. Debts. Transfers. Agreements. Timelines. Every piece reinforced the same conclusion. Ethan had abandoned his engagement because financial rescue had been offered elsewhere. "Does society know?" Charlotte asked quietly. Nathaniel shook his head. "Not yet." Alexander folded his hands. "But they will." Silence followed. Charlotte looked toward the documents again. Strangely, she felt no triumph. Only clarity. The truth no longer hurt. It simply existed. "What happens now?" she asked. Alexander's expression remained calm. "That depends upon them." The answer proved prophetic. 2 days later, an unexpected visitor arrived at Ravenshire House. Ethan Fairmorn. Charlotte learned of his presence from a footman shortly after noon. For several seconds she simply stared. Ethan was here. At Ravenshire House. Requesting a meeting. Alexander received the news without visible surprise. "Show him to the blue drawing room." The footman bowed and departed. Charlotte looked at her husband. "You expected this?" Alexander nodded. Eventually. Why? Because people rarely remain silent once the truth becomes unavoidable. 20 minutes later, Charlotte entered the blue drawing room beside Alexander. Ethan stood near the fireplace. He looked older than she remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. The confidence he once carried so easily seemed diminished. When he saw Charlotte, genuine discomfort crossed his face. Charlotte. She inclined her head politely. Mr. Fairmorn. The formal address visibly stung. Ethan glanced toward Alexander before speaking. I appreciate your willingness to meet. Alexander remained calm. You requested the meeting. Ethan exhaled slowly. For several moments he appeared uncertain how to begin. Finally he looked directly at Charlotte. I owe you an apology. Silence filled the room. Charlotte felt no anger. No bitterness. Only curiosity. Ethan continued. I should have been honest long before the engagement ended. Yes. The answer came quietly. Ethan nodded. I was in serious financial trouble. Charlotte said nothing. At first I believed I could solve it myself. He laughed softly. The sound contained no humor. Then I convinced myself I had no choice. Charlotte studied him carefully. For the first time, she realized something important. Ethan was not evil. He was weak. There was a difference. And Victoria, she asked. Ethan looked away. Victoria knew. The answer hurt him to admit. That much was obvious. Did you love her? Silence stretched. Finally Ethan answered. Not the way I should have. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. The honesty mattered. Not because it changed the past. Because it ended the lies. Ethan looked at Alexander. The evidence will become public eventually. Alexander did not deny it. Most likely. Ethan nodded. Then I wanted to apologize before that happens. Charlotte felt an unexpected sense of peace. This conversation would once have devastated her. Now it simply confirmed how far she had traveled. I accept your apology. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. You do? Charlotte smiled faintly. Forgiveness is easier when one no longer wishes for a different ending. The room became very quiet. Ethan looked down. Then he nodded slowly. I hope you are happy. Charlotte glanced toward Alexander. Their eyes met. Warmth moved through her chest immediately. I am. Ethan followed her gaze. Something like understanding crossed his expression. Perhaps for the first time, he truly saw what he had lost. Not a title. Not a future duchess. Charlotte herself. The realization arrived too late. Several evenings later, the Beaumont Winter Gala arrived. The grand ballroom blazed with light. Music echoed beneath towering ceilings. Hundreds of guests filled the magnificent space. Charlotte entered on Alexander's arm and immediately sensed something different. People were watching. Not with curiosity. With anticipation. Rumors had begun spreading. Quietly at first. Then more rapidly. Financial records. Broken promises. Hidden arrangements. Society had started connecting pieces of the story. Charlotte remained calm. Alexander remained calmer. Together they moved through the ballroom greeting acquaintances. Then the moment arrived. Near the center of the room, a conversation abruptly stopped as Lord Beaumont greeted them. Several influential guests stood nearby. Among them were Ethan and Victoria. Charlotte noticed Victoria immediately. The woman appeared tense. Far more tense than usual. Lord Beaumont smiled warmly. Your Grace. Duchess. Greetings were exchanged. Then another guest mentioned recent financial investigations involving several investment groups. The silence that followed felt deliberate. Everyone understood the implication. Victoria's face paled. Ethan looked exhausted. Lord Holloway stood several yards away speaking with another gentleman. Yet even he seemed aware of the attention shifting toward him. Society smelled scandal. And society loved scandal. Charlotte felt dozens of eyes moving between the various participants. Months ago she would have dreaded such a moment. Not anymore. Alexander stepped slightly closer to her. The movement was subtle. Yet she felt it. Support. Protection. Presence. One guest finally spoke. It appears certain truths have become clearer recently. The statement hung in the air. No names were mentioned. None were necessary. Victoria looked as though she wished the floor would open beneath her. Charlotte surprised herself by feeling sympathy. Because living a lie carried consequences no amount of wealth could erase. Then Alexander did something remarkable. He looked directly at Charlotte before addressing the surrounding group. His voice remained calm. Effortlessly authoritative. Whatever misunderstandings existed in the past, one fact has never changed. The ballroom seemed to quiet around them. Conversation slowed. Attention sharpened. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken. Alexander continued. My wife has conducted herself with dignity, kindness, and grace through circumstances that would have diminished many people. Complete silence now. Guests listened openly. Her character required no validation from society. He paused. His gaze never leaving Charlotte. But she has always deserved its respect. The words settled across the ballroom with extraordinary force. Charlotte felt emotion rise suddenly in her throat. Around them, heads nodded. Several guests looked embarrassed. Others looked impressed. A few appeared deeply moved. For the first time since her broken engagement, the entire narrative changed publicly. Not abandoned fiancé. Not fortunate duchess. Not object of gossip. Charlotte Ashford Ravenshire. A woman worthy of respect in her own right. Lord Beaumont lifted his glass. Here, here. Others followed. Then more. Within seconds, agreement spread through the crowd. Quiet at first. Then unmistakable. Charlotte stood completely still. Overwhelmed. Not by attention. By validation. The kind she had never requested yet deeply needed. Across the room, Victoria lowered her eyes. Ethan remained silent. The truth had finally arrived. Not through humiliation. Through honesty. And in that moment, surrounded by the very society that once whispered about her failure, Charlotte realized she no longer needed their approval. Because the one person whose opinion mattered had already chosen her. Publicly. Proudly. Without hesitation. And as Alexander's hand closed gently around hers beneath the glittering chandeliers, she understood that the story which began with betrayal was about to end with something infinitely stronger. Love recognized at last. Spring arrived quietly at Ravenshire Manor. Snow melted from the hills. Bare branches filled with new leaves. Gardens that had slept beneath winter frost awakened in a riot of color. The estate seemed transformed. Yet not nearly as transformed as Charlotte. 6 months earlier she had walked through life carrying wounds she believed would never fully heal. Now she stood beside an open window overlooking the eastern gardens and felt something she had not expected to find again. Peace. Real peace. Not the fragile kind dependent upon circumstances. The deeper kind built through trust, love, and hard-earned certainty. Somewhere below, workers prepared flower beds for the coming season. Birds sang from nearby trees. The world moved forward. And for the first time in a very long time, Charlotte found herself looking toward the future with excitement rather than caution. A soft knock sounded behind her. She turned. Alexander stood in the doorway. His expression immediately softened when he saw her. The sight still affected her. Perhaps it always would. There you are. Charlotte smiled. I was beginning to suspect you employed spies. Only when necessary. She laughed. An alarming answer. Alexander crossed the room. As always, his presence brought with it a sense of calm she had never found with anyone else. Not because he solved every problem. Because he never allowed her to face problems alone. Nathaniel has informed me that several villagers are waiting to discuss the new school. Charlotte's face brightened instantly. Already? Apparently your reputation for improving people's lives has spread. Charlotte shook her head. That is not my reputation. It should be. The answer came so naturally that she could not help smiling. Alexander had become remarkably consistent in one particular area. He saw the best in her. Sometimes more clearly than she saw it herself. Several hours later they walked together through the village near the estate. Children played along the road. Shopkeepers offered cheerful greetings. Families waved as they passed. Charlotte had spent months helping expand educational programs, improve housing conditions, and support several struggling families. None of it felt extraordinary to her. Yet the gratitude she encountered remained genuine. As they approached the newly renovated schoolhouse, a young girl ran toward them carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. She could not have been older than 8. For the Duchess. Charlotte immediately knelt to accept them. Thank you. The girl's smile widened. Mama says you're the reason we have books now. Charlotte felt emotion tighten her throat unexpectedly. Your mother is very kind. The child looked toward Alexander. And the Duke too. Alexander nodded solemnly. I assisted occasionally. The girl laughed before hurrying away. Charlotte remained kneeling for a moment, staring at the flowers in her hands. When she finally rose, Alexander was watching her. What? She asked softly. Nothing. A faint smile touched his lips. I simply enjoy seeing you happy. The word settled warmly inside her chest. Because she believed him completely. That evening, after returning to the manor, they shared dinner alone in a smaller dining room overlooking the gardens. Candlelight reflected softly against crystal glasses. The atmosphere felt intimate without effort. Comfortable without performance. The sort of evening Charlotte had once imagined only existed in novels. They discussed estate matters. Future projects. Letters from friends and family. Eventually the conversation drifted elsewhere. Eleanor is coming next month. Alexander reached for his wineglass. Charlotte laughed. We should begin preparing immediately. For her visit? For her opinions. Alexander smiled. A wise precaution. Silence followed. Comfortable silence. The best kind. Then Charlotte looked at him thoughtfully. May I ask you something? Alexander immediately set down his glass. Always. The familiar answer warmed her. When exactly did you realize you loved me? For perhaps the first time all evening, the Duke of Ravenshire looked genuinely caught off guard. Charlotte enjoyed the sight far more than she should have. That is not a fair question. Why not? Because the answer is embarrassing. Charlotte's smile widened. Now I am even more interested. Alexander sighed dramatically. You are relentless. I've been told that before. He looked toward the fireplace as though considering escape. Unfortunately for him, none appeared available. Finally he laughed softly. The charity event. Charlotte blinked. For years ago. Yes. That quickly. Alexander nodded. You were arguing. Charlotte groaned immediately. Of course I was. Passionately. That does not improve the story. Alexander's smile deepened. It does for me. Charlotte covered her face with one hand. This is humiliating. I found it impressive. His voice softened. You cared more about helping strangers than protecting your own image. Charlotte lowered her hand slowly. The warmth in his eyes stole her breath for a moment. You remember all of that. Every detail. The answer arrived without hesitation. Charlotte felt tears threatening once again. She blamed him entirely. You make it very difficult to maintain composure. Alexander's expression grew unexpectedly tender. Good. The simple word carried years of affection behind it. Years of patience. Years of waiting. Charlotte suddenly realized something important. She had spent months discovering who Alexander truly was. Yet he had already known who she was long before their story began. Not because he idealized her. Because he paid attention. The realization felt more romantic than any grand declaration. Later that evening, as twilight settled across the estate, they walked through the gardens together. Spring flowers lined the pathways. Gentle breezes carried the scent of blooming roses. Somewhere nearby, water flowed through a small stone fountain. The world felt impossibly peaceful. Charlotte slowed near a familiar bench overlooking the western lawns. "This was your favorite place before we married." Alexander's observation surprised her. "You remember that too?" "Yes." Charlotte shook her head in disbelief. "That is almost unsettling. I prefer devoted." She laughed. The sound echoed softly through the evening air. Then silence settled once more. Not awkward. Not uncertain. Simply full. Charlotte looked toward the horizon where the setting sun painted the countryside in shades of gold and amber. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander turned immediately. "Regret what?" "Waiting so long." The answer came before she even finished speaking. "Never." Charlotte looked at him. He meant it. Every word. "Not even when you thought I would marry someone else." A shadow crossed his expression. Then disappeared. That was painful. His honesty never failed to affect her. But regret? He shook his head. No. Charlotte's heart tightened. Alexander reached for her hand. His fingers intertwined with hers naturally now. Effortlessly. "Because if I had told you sooner, I would have always wondered whether your feelings were genuine." Charlotte listened quietly. "And now?" A faint smile appeared. "Now I know." Emotion rose so quickly she could barely speak. Not because of what he said. Because of how completely he trusted her. She squeezed his hand gently. "Good." Alexander's smile softened. "Good." They remained there for a long time. Watching the sunset. Watching the future unfold before them. Months later, when London society spoke of Charlotte Ravenshire, the conversation sounded very different than before. No longer the abandoned fiancée. No longer the object of speculation. People spoke of her charitable work. Her intelligence. Her kindness. Her partnership with the Duke of Ravenshire. The truth had finally replaced the rumors. As for Ethan Fairmorn and Victoria, society eventually moved on. As it always did. Scandals faded. New stories emerged. Life continued. Charlotte wished them no harm. She simply wished them wisdom. Because some lessons could only be learned through consequences. And some blessings could only be recognized after they were nearly lost. 1 year after their wedding, a spring gala was held at Ravenshire Manor. Friends and family gathered from across England. Music filled the gardens. Laughter echoed beneath lantern-lit trees. The evening felt joyful from beginning to end. Near sunset, Charlotte stood with Eleanor overlooking the festivities below. The Dowager Duchess smiled knowingly. "You look happy." Charlotte followed her gaze toward Alexander, who was speaking with several guests across the lawn. Even from a distance, she could recognize the man who had quietly changed her life. "I am." Eleanor nodded. "Good." Charlotte smiled. "You already knew that." "Of course I did." They laughed together. A few moments later, Alexander crossed the lawn toward them. His gaze found Charlotte immediately. It always did. Eleanor noticed and shook her head dramatically. "I shall leave you two before I witness anything excessively sentimental." She departed before either could protest. Charlotte laughed. Alexander reached her seconds later. "Should I be concerned? Apparently we are becoming predictable." "That sounds serious." "Terribly." His smile deepened. Then he offered his hand. "Dance with me." Music drifted across the gardens. Soft. Beautiful. Familiar. Charlotte placed her hand in his without hesitation. I thought you'd never ask. Alexander guided her toward the lantern-lit lawn where couples already danced beneath the evening sky. Around them, friends smiled. Family watched proudly. The world felt warm and bright and wonderfully ordinary. As they moved together beneath the fading light, Charlotte looked up at the man who had chosen her long before anyone else truly saw her. The man who had protected her dignity when others questioned it. The man who had loved her patiently, quietly, and completely. And she realized that the greatest miracle of her life had never been becoming a duchess. It had been becoming the wife of a man who valued her exactly as she was. Alexander seemed to read the thought in her eyes. "What are you thinking?" Charlotte smiled. "That I was very fortunate." He shook his head immediately. "No." The familiar answer made her laugh. Then, surrounded by the people who mattered most and the life they had built together, he repeated the truth he had declared long ago. The truth that had changed everything. I was. And this time, there was no doubt at all.